Not quite. All right. Hello. Last minute live stream, seeing if we can make some sense of this budget together. If you have been unwise enough to tune in, let's see what we've got.
For midweek insiders. This is the live shot from the House of Representatives, where the Treasurer will give his speech any moment now. The Speaker, Milton Dick, stepping up. Let's take you live now to the floor of the House of Representatives and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
I have received a message from Her Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2025-2026. And I call the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I present the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 25-26 and the explanatory memorandum.
I call the Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government.
I'll get to it in a second. This is just our preliminary stuff. Here we go.
Call to the Treasurer.
I move that the bill be now read a second time, and I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people here and the Yuggera and the Yugambeh back home. Speaker, this budget builds on the progress that we have made together. It's a plan to help with the cost of living, with 2 new tax cuts and higher wages, more bulk billing and more help with electricity bills, cheaper medicine and less student debt. It's a plan to build Australia's future with more homes, new investments in skills and education, competition reforms and a future made in Australia. Yeah. Speaker, our economy is turning the corner. Inflation is down, incomes are rising, unemployment is low, interest rates are coming down, debt is down, and growth is picking up momentum. On all of these fronts, our economy and our budget are in better shape than they were 3 years ago. Yeah. Now, this progress has been exceptional but not accidental. The credit belongs to Australians in every corner of our country. We've come a long way together, but there is more work to do. This budget is our plan for a new generation of prosperity in a new world of uncertainty. It's a plan to help finish the fight against inflation, rebuild living standards and maximise our national advantages into the future. This is a responsible budget with 5 main priorities: helping with the cost of living, strengthening Medicare, building more homes, investing in every stage of education, and making our economy stronger, more productive and more resilient. Speaker, the global economy is volatile and unpredictable. The 2020s have already seen a global pandemic, global inflation and now the threat of a global trade war. The whole world has changed as a consequence. Tariffs and tensions abroad have been accompanied by storms here at home. Ex-tropical cyclone Alfred could wipe 1/4 percentage point off quarterly growth. North and far north Queensland have flooded too. Storm clouds are gathering in the global economy as well. Trade disruptions are rising. China's growth is slowing. War is still raging in Europe and a ceasefire in the Middle East is breaking down. Treasury expects the global economy to grow 3.25% for the next 3 years, its slowest since the 1990s. It's already forecasting the 2 biggest economies in the world will slow next year, with risks weighing more heavily on both. Australia is neither uniquely impacted nor immune from these pressures, but we are among the best placed to navigate them. We're emerging from this spike in global inflation in better shape than almost any other advanced economy. Growth is forecast to pick up from 1.5% this year to 2.5% in 2026-27. The private sector is resuming its rightful place as the main driver of this growth, with Treasury upgrading forecasts for growth in private demand to more than double next year compared to this one. Unemployment is now projected to peak lower at 4.25%. Employment and real wage growth this year will be stronger, and participation will stay near its record high for longer. Inflation is coming down faster as well. Treasury now expects inflation to be sustainably back in the band 6 months earlier than anticipated. Now, all of this means that the soft landing that we have been planning for and preparing for is now looking more and more likely. Because of our collective efforts, the worst is behind us and the economy is now heading in the right direction. But there's more work to do because we know that people are still under pressure. The cost of living is front of mind for most Australians, and it is front and centre in this budget. We know the welcome improvements in the aggregate numbers don't always immediately translate to how people are feeling and faring. We've made a lot of progress together, but we know that many people are still doing it tough. Our plan to rebuild living standards starts with cost of living help and wages growth. It includes more hip pocket help for households, 2 new tax cuts for every taxpayer, more energy bill relief, increasing wages and reforming non-compete clauses, more bulk billing and cheaper medicines, student debt relief, and a fair go for families at the checkout and for farmers at the farm gate. Speaker, tonight the government is proud to be delivering more tax relief. Every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut next year and the year after to top up the tax cuts which began in July. This will take the first tax rate down to its lowest level in more than half a century. These additional tax cuts are modest, but they will make a difference. The average earner will have an extra $536 in their pocket each year when they're fully implemented. Combined with our first round of tax cuts, this is $2,190.
If true, this is great stuff. I mean, the Liberals are going to need to top this.
Or about $50 a week. We'll also increase the Medicare levy low-income thresholds, which is extra tax relief for more than 1 million Australians. Now, our $17 billion in tax cuts are the biggest part of the responsible cost of living package in this budget, but they're not the only part. Mr. Speaker, electricity prices in the official data went down 25% last year, but they're still putting pressure on households around the world. 2 rounds of energy rebates have helped take some of the sting out of energy costs. Tonight, we're providing another $1.8 billion in energy bill relief. Every household and around 1 million small businesses will receive energy rebates until the end of 2025. This means cutting another $150 off bills this year. The government will also be using the powers and penalties of the energy regulators and the ACCC to help ensure that energy companies offer customers cheaper deals, that pensioners receive the discounts that they are entitled to, and that Australians get the value that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, at the core of our economic plan and at the very heart of this Labor government is a simple objective: to ensure more Australians earn more and keep more of what they earn. In the 5 quarters before our first budget, real wages fell in annual terms. They have now grown for the last 5. Real incomes per capita are now growing too. This is the dividend of our economic plan to get inflation down and wages up and tax cuts flowing. Tonight, we're providing an additional $2.6 billion to fund pay rises for aged care nurses from March this year, so that the workers that we trust to care for our parents and grandparents get paid properly for the work that they do. We're reforming non-compete clauses to lift wages by up to $2,500 a year for workers covered by them. We've supported an historic wage increase for the early childhood educators and care workforce. And we've backed pay rises which ensure the national minimum wage has risen by almost $7,500 a year. Speaker, we know that Australians, despite all of this, are still under pressure, and a lot of that pressure is felt at the checkout. That's why we're cracking down on the supermarkets, by empowering the competition watchdog, making the food and grocery code mandatory, increasing penalties and boosting competition. At the same time, we're targeting excessive surcharging and scams and unfair trading practices that harm consumers. Speaker, a university education is a life-changing opportunity, but it shouldn't leave Australians with a lifetime of debt. This year, we will cut 20% of all student loan debts, raise the minimum repayment threshold and reduce repayment rates. Combined with our existing student debt relief, we will slash $19 billion in debt for more than 3 million Australians. Speaker, in every budget, including this one, we have made medicines cheaper. Tonight, we reduced the maximum price for a PBS script from $31.60 to $25. And pensioners and concession card holders will still pay $7.70 a script because we froze their costs as well. We're also investing $1.8 billion to list more life-changing and life-saving medicines on the PBS. For example, cutting the cost of a lymphoma treatment will save some Australians more than $600,000. Speaker, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is a great Labor creation and it's a great Australian institution. And we are strengthening it because Australians need us to, not weakening it because American multinationals want us to. A Labor government created Medicare as well, and only Labor governments strengthen it. Tonight, we are proud to make the single biggest commitment to Medicare since its creation. A record $8.5 billion to lift bulk billing rates and build our health workforce. Because of this investment, 9 out of 10 GP visits should be fully bulk billed by the end of the decade. More bulk billing will mean less pressure on families. These incentives mean there will be around 4,800 fully bulk billing practices around the country, making it easier to see a doctor and get the care that you need, and saving patients around $860 million a year. This budget also delivers new incentives for doctors to train as GPs, new scholarships for nurses and midwives, and another 50 Medicare urgent care clinics. This is a $644 million investment in this budget to build on the 87 urgent care clinics that we've already opened. 4 in every 5 Australians will live within a 20-minute drive of an urgent care clinic as a consequence. Opening early, closing late, available on weekends, taking pressure off hospitals and emergency departments, and all you need is your Medicare card. Every single state and territory will also get more money for hospitals in this budget, funding that will reduce waiting times. Tonight, we're locking in an extra $1.8 billion, taking our total contribution to public hospitals to $33.9 billion next year. Speaker, we're proud to be investing $793 million in this budget in women's health to create more choices and lower costs and deliver better health care for women. This funding will help Australian women save on contraception, access more endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics, and receive better support through menopause. Because for our government, women's health is not a boutique issue or a question of special interest. It is a national priority. Speaker, new plans for cost of living and health are accompanied by new investments in housing. We are tackling the housing shortage from every responsible angle, making home ownership more affordable for young Australians and for young families in particular. Our $33 billion plan will help build 1.2 million new homes before the decade is out. This includes $54 million to accelerate the uptake of modern methods of housing construction, which is all about building more homes more quickly. It supports our work to cut red tape and reduce financial barriers to more efficient construction methods. The first 2 rounds of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund are helping to build about 18,000 social and affordable homes for those who need them most. And lifting the cap on Housing Australia's financial liabilities to $26 billion also helps in this regard. We're making sure new properties are well located and connected to the infrastructure that they require. Our housing support program is funding the crucial roads, water and power that these new homes need. Our national leadership is incentivising states and territories to reform their planning systems to accelerate new housing supply. And to build more, we know that we also need to train more builders. That's why we're attracting more apprentices into the housing industry by doubling incentive payments so that eligible apprentices get up to $10,000 if they train up in the housing construction sector. Speaker, tonight we're expanding our Help to Buy scheme as well. This is part of our efforts to help ensure more Australians can buy a place of their own. We will update the property price and income caps so more first home buyers are eligible for the scheme. And this will help 40,000 Australians buy their first home in the next 4 years. And the changes mean that they can access a bigger range of homes and buy one that suits them. And we're easing pressure on the housing market by banning foreign investors from buying established homes and cracking down on foreign land banking as well. Speaker, a crucial part of this Labor government's economic plan relies on the transformational power of education, its power to turn aspiration and ambition into reality. And this is why we're investing in every stage of education, to lay the foundation for a better and fairer system and teach and train Australians for the jobs of the future. Speaker, this all starts with early childhood education and care. We believe every child has the right to an early education to ensure that they don't start school behind. Cheaper childcare is also cost of living relief with an economic dividend. A key part of our plan to rebuild living standards is to help people work more and earn more if they want to. That means breaking down the barriers to workforce participation. So from January 2026, we are replacing the childcare subsidy activity test with a new 3-day guarantee. This will make sure families are entitled to at least 3 days a week of subsidised early childhood education and care. We're also building more childcare centres in areas of need, investing $5 billion to expand access across the country and lift the wages of early educators, and charting a path to universal early education and care, regardless of a child's background or no matter where they live. Speaker, we're also putting billions into public schools in this budget to open the doors of opportunity for more Australian children. We're fully and fairly funding public schools to help students catch up, keep up and finish school. This means public schools will finally be on track to reach the funding standard recommended in the Gonski Review almost 15 years ago. On top of this, our fee-free TAFE program will help equip Australians for the jobs of the future. Over the next decade, 9 out of 10 new jobs will require post-secondary qualifications. Almost half of these will be from vocational training. We've introduced legislation to lock in 100,000 free TAFE places annually from 2027, and we've committed $1.6 billion to fund these places until 2035 to make it easier for Australians to train, retrain and upskill. Speaker, we see this as an important way, or one way, to ensure Australians can be primary beneficiaries of all of this churn and change that we're seeing around the world. Another is by investing in our comparative advantages, or by looking for opportunities to join with our partners in new, more resilient global supply chains, by becoming an indispensable part of the global net zero economy, by preparing our people to adjust to and succeed in the new world being created right in front of us, by building a future made in Australia. Now, a big part of this depends on boosting productivity the right way to lift living standards over the long term. Now, our plan for productivity growth doesn't mean making Australians work longer for less. It's about investing in our people and doing more to unlock our potential by boosting dynamism and competition in our economy. We've created a $900 million fund to reward state governments for implementing reforms that promote competition. And tonight we are advancing this substantial economic reform agenda. We will abolish non-compete clauses for most Australian workers. Non-competes are holding too many Australians back from switching to better, higher paying jobs. More than 3 million Australians are captured by these clauses, including childcare workers, construction workers and hairdressers. People shouldn't need to hire a lawyer to take the next step in their career, or permission from their old boss if they want to be their own boss and turn an idea into a small business. The Productivity Commission estimates that this reform could lift productivity, reduce inflation and improve GDP by $5 billion. And it could boost wages by up to 4%. We're also introducing a national licensing scheme to allow electricians to work seamlessly across borders. This will be a template for expanding national licensing to other occupations when and where we can. The PC suggests these broader licensing reforms could boost GDP by up to $10.3 billion. Mr. Speaker, Australia is well placed to respond to the 5 seismic challenges shaping this new world of uncertainty. The shift from globalisation to fragmentation, from hydrocarbons to renewables, from information technology to AI, from a younger population to an older one, and all of the changes in our industrial base. Now, all of this puts a premium on resilience, and that's what a future made in Australia is all about. In this budget, we're investing more than $3 billion to support the production of Australian-made green metals like aluminium and iron, building on the tax incentives for critical minerals and green hydrogen that we legislated last year. We're also backing clean technologies through our Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund and by recapitalising the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. This will help develop new industries in clean energy manufacturing, green metals and low-carbon liquid fuels, and unlock more private investment. This agenda is about recognising that our future growth prospects lie at the intersection of our industrial, resources, skills and energy bases and our attractiveness as an investment destination, so that we can grasp the jobs and opportunities of the net zero transformation. Speaker, in difficult conditions, around 25,000 new businesses have been created each month on average since we came to office. Now, we respect and admire the hard work and aspiration and sacrifice behind those record numbers, which is why we're going into bat for small and local businesses in this budget, protecting them from unfair trading practices, funding our Buy Australian campaign to support local producers, providing new resources for the regulator to level the playing field for smaller players, and delivering tax relief for hospitality venues, brewers, distillers and wine producers as well. Speaker, building Australia's future also means building on the strength of our regions. That's why we're securing banking services in country towns and flights in the bush. It's also why we're investing up to $3 billion in additional equity to complete the rollout of the national broadband network. Infrastructure like the NBN is essential for communities and students and businesses and to the productivity of our nation. And so are the roads and railways connecting our regions to our cities and supporting economic growth. This budget provides $17.1 billion over 10 years for these projects, including $7.2 billion to upgrade the Bruce Highway in Queensland, the biggest ever investment in the Bruce. $2.3 billion for Western Sydney, with $1 billion of that for the rail network alone. And $2 billion towards transforming Sunshine Station, taking our Melbourne Airport rail investments to $7 billion. In total, we're investing more than $120 billion in infrastructure in every state and territory over the decade, improving the productivity, resilience, livability and sustainability of our cities, regions and communities, accompanied by $262 million to preserve and conserve our natural land and our ocean assets. Speaker, in these uncertain times, economic security and national security are increasingly intertwined. We're supporting stability and prosperity in our region by helping to shore up banking services in the Pacific. We've invested an extra $50 billion in defence by the mid-2030s to help keep Australians safe. It means defence funding will grow beyond 2.3% of GDP by the early 2030s. And we're investing $45 million in our initial response to the independent intelligence review. So, Mr. Speaker, in a tight budget, we've made room to boost our defences, strengthen Medicare, help people doing it tough, build more homes and invest in the future. We've done all of this at the same time as we've overseen the biggest ever fiscal improvement in a single term of government. Tonight's budget is $207 billion better than we inherited. It's in better shape in every year over the forward estimates than it was 3 years ago. In our first 2 years, we posted the first back-to-back surpluses in nearly 2 decades. Our deficit this year has almost halved since we came to office. Next year's deficit is $42 billion, lower than what was forecast at the last election and lower than at the mid-year update. Gross debt will hit $940 billion this financial year, $177 billion lower than what we inherited. This means we'll avoid around $60 billion in interest costs over the decade. These are some of the dividends of our responsible economic management, achieved through a combination of spending restraint, finding savings and banking revenue upgrades. Real payments growth is forecast to average 1.7% to 28-29, less than half of the average under our predecessors. We've found around $94 billion of savings since coming to government, including another $2 billion in this budget. In this term, we've banked around 70% of tax receipt upgrades, and we've made structural improvements to the budget across the NDIS, aged care and interest costs as well. And Speaker, we're repairing the budget without ignoring our responsibility to build a stronger, fairer and more inclusive society, where more Australians have the chance to contribute and share in our economic success. We're providing $1.3 billion for closing the gap and economic self-determination for First Nations Australians, with investments in remote community services, opportunities for business and support for home ownership. Tonight's budget also includes $424 million for Australians with a disability and more funding for aged care reform. There's more money to support veterans and build on the progress that we have made eliminating that backlog of claims. And we're providing help to Australians and communities affected by natural disasters, provisioning another $1.2 billion to properly fund recovery from ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, as part of $13.5 billion in natural disaster funding for further north and right around the country. So, Mr. Speaker, it's even more important and even more remarkable that Australia's economy is turning the corner when we know that the global economy is taking a turn for the worse. Our progress and our prospects validate and vindicate the decisions and the sacrifices that we've made together as Australians to bring inflation and debt down, to get wages and growth up, and to keep unemployment low. And what really matters is that we build on this platform, how we help finish the fight against inflation, how we keep rebuilding living standards, and how we maximise our national advantages to benefit Middle Australia. The plan at the core of this budget is about more than putting the worst behind us. It's about seizing the best of what's ahead of us, to build a stronger economy together and to build a future that we can all be proud of. And that's why I commend this bill and this budget to the House.
Well, that was something. Let me have this sound on in the background so I can see what they go to next. Now, I'm still blown away by that news at the beginning. And I want to... I don't know if you guys had a chance to see it, but I had an article in the Spectator today that I basically called on Labor to, if the Liberals won't cut a tax, Labor cut a tax, and you'd be able to outflank the Liberals in actually doing something on productivity and taxes and our absurd tax system. And I suggested a bunch of options, including one being cut the bottom rate. My suggestion was make it an aspirational goal to cut the bottom rate. I'll take up more of the space. I suggested make it an aspirational goal to cut the bottom rate to 0, so you could increase the tax-free threshold to 45 and then push it up to 50. Those who've been watching along at these ATA lives would have seen us talking about that. But my suggestion was the way to do that is by start cutting that lowest rate from 16 down to 15 down to 14. They're doing exactly that. I mean, don't get me wrong. Nearly the rest of the budget was all just handing out money they didn't have. They've got hit in the ass with a revenue rainbow, which is massively higher taxes than they expected, and they've spent nearly all of those higher taxes on various handouts and health spending and what have you. So I'm not saying that I am in love with this budget, but I expected that. I guess this was the expectations, right? My expectation was they'd do everything bad. They've now cut a tax.
Over 5 years.
Can we actually afford it?
Yes, we can.
Typical.
And we're providing these tax cuts in the most responsible way that we can.
The government will
Of course,
also
ABC would
ensure
come out
a
against the
million
tax cuts.
Australians avoid the full Medicare levy by increasing the threshold at which it's paid. It comes on top of a suite of cost of living measures, lowering power bills through a $150 rebate,
Quite bad policy.
making medicines cheaper by capping the cost of PBS-listed medicines at $25.
That's not the right way to do PBS either.
And increasing incentives paid to doctors to drive up bulk billing rates. $35 billion in new policies paid for by a $36 billion windfall. Treasury finding a bit of wriggle room in the budget.
On top of existing spending, Labor's back-to-back surpluses will become a decade of deficits. This year's deficit marginally better than forecast at $27.6 billion, rising rapidly next year before falling back to around $37 billion in 4 years' time. Including off-budget spending adds another $104 billion over the next 5 years. It's all driving up net debt.
Yeah, look, I see the comments coming in. There's not a lot of love for this budget, but I mean, the question I have for you is: did you expect them to do anything in this budget? Yeah, Tyrant, surprise stream. I saw the budget. I thought quickly I'll jump on. I'll say something. I don't know what I had to say. I didn't go to the budget lockup. I hadn't seen the budget beforehand. People saw my reaction live as Labor came out and has flanked the Liberals. The Liberals have stubbornly refused to release a tax cut policy for the last year. I mean, for the last ever. We've been pushing them to. I mean, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, taxpayers.org.au, we've been having conversations with politicians, encouraging them that tax cuts was both the right thing to do economically and made for good politics. Up until this point, we're constantly told, wait for it, there's something coming, we'll see. But up until this point, the Liberals have shied away from offering any serious tax cuts. And so in an article I wrote today for the Spectator Australian, which I'll see if I can get the link and chuck it up on here if people are members, or if you're members, spectators, spectator.org.au, and then look for my name. But in that, I said, let me see if I can find my article. Quoting from myself here in that, several of the proposed tax cuts, because I listed a series of tax cuts, a series of options for cutting tax to in a way that is affordable, manageable, moderate, inside the Overton window, that could be done by a major party. I said several of these proposed tax cuts would suit a reforming Labor government that is serious about economic policy. The current Albanese government has so far shown little interest in reform, but embracing one of the above policies would potentially change that reputation and put the Liberals on the back foot. And the very first one I wrote down here, reduce the bottom marginal tax rate with the aspirational goal of eventually reducing it to 0 so that low-income earners are not caught both paying income tax while losing welfare payments at the same time. An immediate 1 to 2% cut would benefit all taxpayers, improve incentives for low-income earners, and costing less than the value of bracket creep, while the long-term plan would show vision. And they've done exactly that, a 2% cut over the next 3 years. Now, it's low, it's slower than I'd like. But the point I make is, and I feel almost bad for making it, but this budget is better than I expected because it has at least a tax cut in it. Look, true, Roger. It's very true. I'd only say that I think that's kind of a prerequisite for people who get to the leadership position in major parties. And look, there's lots of lies in a budget. There's lots of lies in politics. But if they put in the budget, they're cutting tax, and that legislation goes to Parliament, then that tax has to cut. Yeah, I had a low bar. I admit that. But I mean, to be fair, Cora, didn't you? I don't know if anyone is here wanting to defend the historical reformist reputation of the Albanese government, so as to say that we should have had high expectations for them. Look, in recent history, both Liberal and Labor, their economic commentary has been quite disappointing, to the point that I had a pretty low bar for both. I had low expectations. Indeed, my opening sentence in this, not my opening sentence, but in this article for the Spectator Australia, I suggest you all go and have a read of it. Budget's top priorities should be income tax cuts. I promise you, I did not know Labor was going to do this when I wrote this article. But in the second paragraph, I wrote, expectations are not high. The budget is predicted to have deficits into the foreseeable future. Yes. Despite runaway income tax revenue. Yes. With billions more in pre-election handouts. Yes. And no serious productivity reform. Well, look, it's not big productivity reform, but they're cutting income tax. It's not a huge cut. I'd like to see more. But if someone takes one small step in the right direction, we don't spit in their face for that and tell them that we don't appreciate it. I mean, that's I'm happy to throw the rest of the budget out, but the Labor government didn't do everything wrong. Look, that's high praise coming from me. And then I wrote after this, the Labor government's low expectations. After that, thus far, the opposition has been content to match the extra spending and reform shyness. This is the wrong approach. Well, I think that's been shown now. I mean, this is potentially a wrong footing move. The Liberals have to respond now. This is going to be interesting. The Liberals are going to have to come out with a serious income tax cut, and I don't know if they have one in their back pocket yet. Because it seemed to me that they were just going to abandon the idea and try to skate in on other policies. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. We'll find out on Thursday. But I mean, this budget response on Thursday evening with Peter Dutton. Maybe we should get together and do that as another surprise stream. But that now is put into a different context. The Liberals are going to have to offer better tax cuts than this, bigger tax cuts and better tax cuts, or they're going to be outflanked on the tax cut end, which is just embarrassing. I mean, they should have been in the lead. They should have got out in front of income tax cuts, owned the issue of tax cuts. Now it's going to be Liberal and Labor quibbling over different types of tax cuts. I really wish the Liberals had taken our advice to put tax cuts on the agenda for this election earlier. I mean, I'd been, for those who've been listening for a while, you'd have been getting sick of me talking about I used to frame it as stage 4. Back when people were still talking about stage 3, I was starting to make the case we need a stage 4 tax cut and a stage 5. This needs to continue. This isn't the end of the stages. And I was trying to pitch that to the Liberals as a way to pivot on the language. Labor is messing around with stage 3. Liberals come out with stage 4. But they have been, I think, caught napping in this instance. So anyway, let's run through some of the rest of the budget. Look, I can I'll see if I can bring up the budget. Now, they are struggling with putting the budget documents up at the moment. They've only got one budget document successfully up. And I will go back to let's see, the ABC. I'll go back when they're interviewing Chalmers and then Angus Taylor.
As it considers how it responds to this budget and tells us what it says it will do.
There are two overarching narratives in the Treasurer's presentation today. One is about Australia's economy turning a corner. The other is the threats to the economy from the global disorder. They both exist within the urgent demands of a federal
Just want to
election.
check to see if they're about to
Treasurer
interview.
now.
Oh, yes,
Welcome,
there we go.
Treasurer, and
Thanks very
congratulations on your highly unusual
Let's have a look at this.
fourth
I'll
budget.
shut up.
I appreciate it, Sarah. Thanks.
Now, budgets, as we know, are about choices. You've chosen to give every Australian worker a tax cut of $1,000, as we've heard. Why are you giving a tax cut to you and to me?
Well, this is about topping up a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, in addition to the tax cuts which are already rolling out from July last year. And so we know that they're modest in isolation, but we think meaningful in combination with all of the tax cuts that we've provided and the other cost of
Is that
living
okay now,
help,
Cora?
that we are rolling out. Now, when it comes to the design of the tax cuts, in order to give a tax cut for every Australian taxpayer, the benefits are felt disproportionately to people we are in
Oh, what the hell?
incomes. They will proportionately be the biggest beneficiaries of these topped up tax cuts, in addition to the tax cuts already rolling out.
Topped up tax cuts, but they're still political. Have you stolen Peter Dutton's thunder here?
Well, I see these tax cuts in economic terms, and it's partly in recognition
As you should. We
that
need.
even as we make this really quite remarkable
How did the Liberals
progress
let this
together
happen?
as Australians in the fight against inflation, we know that people are still under pressure. And so we're providing cost of living relief. Really one of the defining features of this budget is the cost of living relief that we're providing. Often the best way to do that is through the tax system. So we see it in terms of cost of living. We see it in terms of the economic benefits to participation. We found room in a pretty tight budget to provide these tax cuts. The politics will take care of themselves.
No, there's other things, but
Are they
I've just been
fiscally
blown away with the tax
responsible,
cuts
though, in the
so far.
environment we have?
That's all I've been talking
Yes,
about.
they are.
Because that's what I've been
And,
pushing
there's
for.
There's an appetite, obviously, and an enthusiasm often to provide bigger tax cuts. We have to provide the tax cuts we think the budget can afford, and we have to do that in the most responsible way. And that's what's guided us here, to give as much cost of living help as we can in the most responsible way, conscious of the pressures on the budget and also the pressures coming at us from around the world.
So put another way, the political advantage of the tax cuts, whether you don't want to engage, whether you want to engage with that or not, outweighs the impact on the budget.
Well, I think that's for others to determine. You know, I genuinely
but
believe...
I'm here asking you.
Well, I genuinely believe that if you get the big economic decisions right, and we have overwhelmingly done that in the course of the last 3 years, I genuinely believe the politics will take care of themselves. Obviously, I'm not oblivious to the fact that this budget, this fourth budget, a very rare and cherished opportunity, is being delivered on the eve of an election. And it will set up a choice between Labor helping with the cost of living and Peter Dutton, whose secret cuts will make Australians worse off.
Just a question, have you ruled out an inflationary impact of these tax cuts that the RBA would be looking at?
Well, a couple of things about that. I mean, first of all, obviously, I briefed the Reserve Bank Governor on the budget. I do that for every budget and every budget update. I've done that for the last two Reserve Bank governors, and I'll do that for as long as I'm in this job. I think it's important. So I've done that. Secondly, one of the most encouraging things about this budget is that Treasury's actually brought forward its expectations for when inflation gets sustainably in the target band. And so we've provided this cost of living relief in a responsible way, consistent with inflation.
Yeah, but you don't really take credit for that.
Earlier, which is one of our key economic objectives.
But what about that specific question around whether or not there is an inflationary impact of these new tax cuts?
Well, we don't believe there is, for a couple of reasons. One, the timing.
Can you believe this? So you get tax cuts in the ABC, small tax cuts, and the ABC is complaining about it with this fake it's going to cause inflation narrative. Once this is finished, I'm going to rant about that.
Thirdly, we think we've got the magnitude right to provide some topped up tax relief to every Australian taxpayer, but in the most responsible way we can.
Now, it is, as we are saying, of course, a pre-election measure that sits alongside the, I think, around $35 billion in pre-election announcements that you've made since January. How are you going to pay for all of those promises with these tax cuts now sitting on top?
Well, first of all, a large number of those commitments that we've announced over the course of the last few months were already provisioned for in the mid-year budget update. And
some were, not all, yeah.
Well, most of them were before tonight. The big mover, obviously, tonight has been the tax cuts. So if you think about the net policy decisions in the budget, about $35 billion, that is less than what our predecessors committed in their election budget, point number one. Point number two, half of that is the tax cuts, $17 billion in tax cuts. And point number three is $8 billion of that $35 billion was already in the MyEFO.
Now, you were fortunate in your previous budgets with record windfalls, obviously, especially from the mining exports, enabling you to post surpluses. So is what we are seeing now the true picture of your economic management with its unending long-term deficits?
Well, first of all, it's a popular misconception that the recovery in the budget was driven entirely by commodity prices.
I said largely, also tax receipts, but largely by very large...
Commodity prices played a welcome and significant role, as did the strength in the labour market. One of the things we should be proudest of as Australians is that we've got inflation down without seeing a spike in unemployment, and that's had benefits for the budget as well. We've been clear about that. But what matters is when you get those revenue upgrades, what you do with them. And we unusually banked most of those revenue upgrades, without which there wouldn't have been a surplus or a second surplus for the first time in almost 2 decades. Our predecessors spent most of those upgrades. We banked most of them, and that's why we had 2 surpluses.
I think what we're talking about now are the deficits into the future, not what your predecessors did. Let me put it to you in a different way. So over the term of this government, you've overseen the largest spending as a share of the economy since the mid-1980s, outside of crisis, of course. Who is going to pay for all of those commitments into the future?
Well, first of all, during COVID, for understandable reasons, spending as a share of the economy was about 1/3 of the economy. We got it all the way down below 1/4 of the economy, and it's settling a little bit higher than that, largely because of our responsibilities in the care economy and some of those unavoidable investments that we're making as a government. So spending as a share of the economy is settling around the kind of 26s. It was up in the 31s, it got down to the 24s, and now it's settling slightly higher than that. And in every budget, whether it's the $94 billion in savings that we found, the way we've banked upward revisions to revenue, the way we've shown spending restraint when it comes to real spending growth being half the pace of the 30-year average, all of that comes together to make room for our commitments, whether it's strengthening Medicare, providing cost of living help, or investing in the future.
Should we just give the audience the numbers again for what's going to happen to the deficit? $42 billion next year, 35.7 the year after. It's $179.5 billion. We're not talking about banking surpluses. We're talking about what you're going to do to attack that structural position of the budget.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the budget position cumulatively is $207 billion stronger than when we came to office. Okay, and that shouldn't be lightly dismissed.
Yeah, that can be lightly dismissed. That is not relevant. They're not fixing the budget deficit, despite the fact that they got smacked in the ass with a revenue rainbow, just with billions of dollars of money they didn't expect, and yet no real improvement in the budget.
If you look at the overall position, the bottom lines in this budget, it is stronger than what it was only a few months ago in the mid-year budget update. And so we're chipping away. And we're also making sure we make a structural difference to the budget in the NDIS aged care and interest costs.
Yes, actually, let me just ask you about NDIS, because on that particular measure, as you said, it's been a huge pressure on the budget. Yeah. Can you confirm that it's going to hit its reduced target for growth of 8% next year?
Yeah, we're on track for that for sure. We're seeing some very encouraging progress. And the thing that we're encouraged by is that we've been able to get the cost of the NDIS to a more sustainable growth rate, still growing quite quickly, but more sustainably, while we still meet our responsibilities to people who need and deserve the scheme.
Now, there's one other measure that people are talking about today I want to ask you about briefly, and that is the extraordinary increase in the, drop in the tobacco excise. This is a situation where the tax has caused enormous profit to bikies and criminals, a failed policy. How do you fix it?
Well, there's 2 ways that we get tobacco excise down. One's a good way and one's a bad way. The good way is more people give up the darts. That's a good thing.
Yep.
The bad way is more people avoid the excise, and there is a problem. I think we've spoken about this maybe at this set on other occasions. So we're investing more money in enforcement and compliance because we recognise there's a problem here, and we need to collect more of this excise because we've got a problem in people avoiding it.
Let me just let's just talk about how the politics of the big decisions in tonight's budget are going to play out politically. Obviously, we are in the teeth of an election. I think the opposition has responded to your tax cuts. They're calling them a cruel tax hoax. Now, what does that tell you about how these tax cuts are going to be received? There's strong language coming out from the opposition straight away. Is that because you stole Peter Dutton's thunder, or are we looking at a tax hoax?
Well, that's the first I've heard of it. Sounds like they're not supporting our tax cuts, and that's what happened last time we tried to give every Australian taxpayer a tax cut. They didn't support that either. Peter Dutton was so angry about that, he said we should call an election to prevent those tax cuts flowing into the pockets of every Australian taxpayer.
So is it entitled to have a legitimate concern about you piling a tax cut on top of already a budget suffering from a structural deficit whose numbers are...
Please tell me the Liberals aren't going to oppose a tax cut.
We're providing tax relief to every Australian taxpayer. If he doesn't support that, he should say so. If he's got alternatives, he should come clean. And they've had 3 years now, and they still haven't come up or come clean on any costed or credible or coherent economic policies. Angus Taylor's colleagues don't take him seriously. It is an absolute bin fire of incompetence and inconsistency. And what it means is, and as he told your colleague David Spears, Peter Dutton says there'll be hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts. They've got to find $600 billion to pay for nuclear reactors. They can't do that without coming after Medicare. That's why they're not coming clean on their cuts. And this week, they need to come clean on their cuts, because these secret cuts that Peter Dutton has in mind for Australians will make people worse off.
That's a slogan, and I think what the audience wants to understand is how you intend to put policies in place that change the dynamics of the economy that we've heard people talking about all week. That is, we are relying on tax revenue. Right now, you've given you and me $5 or $10 in our pockets, but going forward, who else is going to pay for all of these promises you've made if it's not the taxpayer?
Well, the reason I think that's an unusual question tonight, Sarah, is I've just laid out in lots of detail the government's economic plan to help people with the cost of living, strengthen Medicare and make ourselves more resilient in the face of all of this global economic uncertainty. And all we ask is that 3 years into a 3-year parliamentary term that the opposition does the same thing, to come clean on their cuts and how much worse people will be off as a consequence.
Now, I want to talk about the global uncertainty, because during the next 3-year term, if you get another term, if re-elected, you could face an inflationary global trade war with the US, ongoing demands over Ukraine, and a worsening security situation with China. With all of that uncertainty, would it have been more prudent to tighten the budget now to increase the capacity to respond to crisis?
Look, I don't know if you guys want to be listening to the rest of the
uncertainty.
All right, stop that from changing. The chat about the international, look, they're just going to complain about Trump there. We can leave that on the background in case something's coming up. The M toggles mute. Well, there you go. There's something I didn't know. All right, I said I was going to rant about the inflation. But it's the remarkable thing. The ABC says they're impartial because they criticize both Liberal and Labor, and that's true. But they criticize both Liberal and Labor from the left. Their criticism of Labor here was overwhelmingly, how dare you give tax cuts? It is quite a remarkable indictment on that institution. And, of course, they should be defunded or privatized or sold off or shut down, or they just shouldn't exist as a government-funded agency. But it is quite remarkable. They come out, the Labor Party comes out and, I don't know, accidentally, strategically, Machiavellianly introduce a sort of tax cut. What are the tax cuts that I've been calling for? And Labor's complaint is, oh no, you don't worry about all the spending, billions and billions and billions of dollars of spending. That's not going to be inflationary. But the tax cut, don't you worry, that's going to be inflationary. And isn't it good that the Liberals are going to oppose it? Firstly, I can't imagine the Liberals will actually oppose the tax cut unless they've got a better tax cut. Wow. Well, there you go. Make me a liar straight away. That's, well, if they're opposing this tax cut, it can only be because they have a better tax cut in the offing. And that's going to make Thursday very interesting. I mean, I'd say it's a 50-50 chance that the Liberals have a good tax cut policy in their back pocket. They're waiting for Thursday. And there's another 50% chance they didn't have one. And they're going to have a very long 48 hours scrambling to come up with a tax cutting policy that can match and hopefully exceed what the Labor Party has just done. So that will be interesting. I've got nothing on that except for what Rick says. I'm sure Rick's right. I'd have no reason to doubt him. But here's one of the reasons why this the narrative about tax cuts being inflationary is a bit bullshit. Firstly, as I said yesterday, the whole idea that government deficits are the driver of inflation, it's not the main driver. It can contribute. Certainly it can contribute. But if the RBA is creating tens of billions of dollars of new money, that is the primary driver of the inflation. And when the federal government runs a deficit, that can put more money in the economy, but it doesn't necessarily, because it depends how the federal government gets that money. Because if they spend money, but they get it from taxing you, then there's no new money in the economy. Now, if they spend that money, but they get the money from borrowing from someone in Australia, or someone that would have spent that money elsewhere in Australia, then again, that's just shuffling money around. Now, it's shuffling money in a way I don't like, because it's shuffling it from the private sector to the government sector, which I think is inefficient and inappropriate. But that's just shuffling money around. That's not creating new money. So not all of the government deficit actually creates new money. And so it's not as big a driver of inflation as the Reserve Bank is. Now, I worry about the Labor's policy towards the Reserve Bank. They've kind of been leaning on the Reserve Bank and pressuring them and changing the way they work to try to weaken the inflation hawks inside the Reserve Bank. So I worry about that as a separate front, but I don't think it's true that the deficit is the primary driver of inflation. But even if it were, and it can be in some instances, even if it were, inflation is caused by too much money chasing not enough goods. So when the government just spends money handing it out as a handout or some sort of inefficient spending, then you've got potentially more money sloshing around, depending how they got that money. But you've got no new goods, so you could have the inflation. But if the government cuts tax, then you've potentially got more money sloshing around, again, depending on how they raised that money, how they got the money to hand out in lower taxes. But lower taxes also spur productivity, which means you've got more money, but also chasing more goods. There's a supply and a demand side here. It's the amount of money chasing the amount of goods. If you increase the amount of money, but you increase the amount of goods, that's not inflationary. So government spending is, to the degree that government deficits can be inflationary, government spending is more likely to be inflationary than government tax cuts, because government tax cuts can actually spur the productivity that increases the amount of stuff people are buying in the first place. So remember, it's a two-sided thing with the inflation. It's how much money chasing how many goods. And well-structured tax cuts can be deflationary. I mean, if they boost the economy by more than the amount that they inject money into the economy, they can actually be a mitigating factor against inflation. And yet our ABC, of course, our ABC's primary line of criticism against the Labor government is that the Labor government included some modest tax cuts, God bless them, as they should have. And that's the problem. Labor wants to announce that it's going to be too inflationary, and so they don't want it. Countries held together with band-aids and duct tape. Yeah, so the budget certainly is at this stage. And look, the deficits are quite big. I'm going to just run through some of the budget papers now, because the proper budget papers are now properly available online. Putting more on isn't going to help at all. Well, that's another point. They didn't really even try to address immigration, which, as my ATA offsider Brian Marlow likes. Oh, wait a second. Let's get this. That Liberals have an opportunity to cut inflation, and they should. I mean, immigration.
Budget, which is for the next 5 weeks, not for the next 5 years. And what we see in it is a promise of 70 cents a day in a year's time, which is going to do nothing to restore Australian standard of living to where it was when Labor came to power. There are better structural, fundamental solutions to the cost of living crisis. That's not what's being offered by Labor, and so we won't support what they're doing here.
You do not support the tax cuts?
No. Well, look, let's be clear. They are a cruel hoax. I mean, they are not a genuine tax cut. 70 cents a day, 73 cents a day in a year's time, when for a typical Australian family with a mortgage, they're paying an extra $50,000 over and above what they expected. We need a pathway back to the standard of living that Australians had when Labor came to power. That's not what's being offered by this budget. We don't get there until the end of the decade, and that's simply not good enough.
Let's be clear, because the Treasurer just now described them as top-up tax cuts that went along with the previous tax relief that the government has offered during this term. So should the tax cuts have gone further? Is that what you wanted to see?
No, what we're
further
saying,
and sooner?
if you manage the economy, you don't see a collapse in people's standard of living.
So there's no requirement for tax cuts?
What we think is there is a better way to make sure we restore prosperity in this country. We get back to the standard of living that we had when we were last in power and ahead of it. And that's what Australians are used to. That's not what Labor's offering in this budget. We don't get back to the standard of living, as I said, that Australians had when Labor came to power until the end of the decade.
Let's be absolutely clear. The opposition will not be offering tax cuts as part of its budget in reply, as part of its election campaign
That's
policies.
not what I said. I said we do not support what Labor is putting forward today. We have already announced important tax cuts. We've said that small businesses should be given accelerated depreciation.
Sure, but we're talking about a tax cut for every Australian. Just let's be absolutely clear. We're not talking about specific taxes related to...
Sarah, can I challenge you on this? When a small business makes an investment,
I'm not saying it's unimportant.
That raises the prosperity of all Australians over time. That's how you get productivity. That's how you make sure we're getting ahead. That's how you get a standard of living that's rising all the time.
I just wanted to get some clarity on personal income taxes. You're not in favour. You will not be offering personal income taxes as part of the election.
That's not what I said. I said we will not be supporting what Labor has proposed in this budget, and that's what we're responding to tonight.
All right, let's go to the budget more broadly. How long will it take you, precisely will it take you to bring this budget that you've seen today back to surplus?
Well, we'll make sure that the economy grows faster than spending. That's rule one, and the most important rule when we re-establish the fiscal guardrails that were thrown out by Labor.
I think your colleague
that ensures, Sarah,
within 10 years,
that over time you get back to budget balance. What we see in this budget, $170 billion of deficits, an extra $400 billion or so of spending and taxing since Labor came to power, and no pathway back to prosperity. Well, that's simply not good enough. So the fiscal rules that were in place, put in place by Peter Costello all those years ago, will re-establish. That makes sure and ensures that we've got an economy that grows faster than spending. And that way you can manage the economy, provide prosperity and help Australians to get ahead.
All right, but no time frame on that. But let me ask you another question. You said on Insiders this weekend with my colleague David Spears that you'd wait until you saw the budget to decide how many public servants you're going to sack. You've seen the budget. What are the numbers?
Well, it's gone up again. So we're now at 41,000 additional public servants.
We
have said, well, can I just answer your question?
Yeah.
We have said we'll get back to where we were pre-Labor government when we were last in power. And of course, that was 41,000 less. So that's what we're aiming to get back.
Slash and burn, much lower. Should go much lower than what you had last time.
Increase in the numbers tonight. And of course, that is adding to the costs that all Australians are having to pay. And it's one of the reasons why we've got red ink as far as the eye can see in this budget.
So to be clear, you're saying that you're going to bring forward a policy that will result in 41,000
We'll be looking to get back to where we
jobs.
were when we were last in government.
You were also waiting to see headroom what headroom there was in the budget to determine how much the opposition can afford to spend on defence. What is the number?
Well, I'm not going to preempt announcements that are going to be made over the coming weeks,
including in budget reply. You would be able to do that?
Well, I didn't say I was going to on your program tonight, Sarah.
No, but you did on Sunday. So you've seen the budget now. What's the answer?
I didn't say I was going to do it on your program, and I'm not going to do it on your program. And I'll leave.
You said you needed to
I'll leave these announcements to the appropriate people at the appropriate time. What I will say, though, is that you will see us in the coming weeks focus on economic management, restoring our standard of living, delivering affordable, reliable energy, fixing housing supply, balancing that with immigration, and making sure that we keep Australians safe and secure in a world which is increasingly challenging. And you know, it's as uncertain a world as we have seen since World War II.
I'm short on time, but I want to ask you this. David Littleproud says that the coalition will deliver cheaper gas prices within a year. Can you commit to the same thing?
We will absolutely be putting downward pressure on gas prices. I won't say more about that today, other than to say that they were lower when I was Energy Minister. And the reason they were lower is we made sure there was supply coming out of the ground and going into the Australian network. Australian gas, working for Australians. It's not complicated. This Labor government has absolutely failed to deliver that. And the problem with that is not only higher gas prices, but higher electricity prices, because the gas price plays such an important role in setting the electricity price.
Thank you, Angus Taylor, very much indeed for joining us and bringing us your first response to the government's new tax policy. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
And that's the programme.
Ah, yes, the M key does work, although I do quite like being able to scale the volume. So I'm going to stick with my way, Rob, because I'm getting some smart-ass commentary in the from the cheap seats. So I mean, Angus Taylor is very right about the nature of tax cuts, the importance and necessity of them, and how they do encourage the sort of investment in the capital that you need to actually drive productivity and higher wages. And if you want those higher wages, as these communist journalists always pretend they want, then they shouldn't be so hostile to the tax cuts that Angus is talking about. But beyond that, there wasn't. Oh wow! Look at that! Oh, that's a scary. Did you see that line?
Policy and the politics of this pre-election budget. And a reminder about the ABC's Your Say campaign, your chance to tell us.
All right. Well, that looks very scary. Look, I can understand the skepticism. I'm not suggesting people should go and vote for Labor because of this. I'm suggesting that the Liberals should have owned tax cuts. They should have got there. What Labor's suggesting on these tax cuts is good. It's good to cut tax. I mean, don't let your hatred for Labor blind you to the fact that good things are good and bad things are bad. And if a party you don't like accidentally does something right, you don't pretend that right things are bad. I mean, the current bottom marginal tax rate is 16%. And that 16% goes for people earning between about $18,000 and $45,000. A lot of those people are paying tax and receiving welfare at the same time, which is ridiculous tax welfare churn, which makes no sense. A lot of them are paying tax and losing welfare at the same time, which spikes effective marginal tax rates, creates a massive disincentive and poverty traps, trapping people in lives of poverty where it just doesn't make any financial sense to take a job or take a promotion, which is terrible policy. And the most obvious solution to that is to decrease the tax on those low income earners. So ideally abolish that bottom bracket, get it down to zero. So we have a tax-free threshold up to 45,000, but that's hard to do in one budget. So move towards decreasing that bottom tax bracket, get rid of that 60% tax bracket. And if you can't get rid of it straight away, then at least cut it and keep cutting it. And Labor has cut it. So look, interestingly though, it's a moot point because the election's coming up. But if the Liberals oppose this tax cut, the Greens would oppose it because the Greens are just ideologically against tax cuts. They might not actually be able to pass it through the Parliament. Anyway, moot point because the election's going to come along before they can sit in Parliament again, I imagine. But look, I can understand why the Liberals have to push back against the tax cuts, but that's a good thing that Labor cut tax. We shouldn't. I'm just checking some messages coming in. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be pushed away from tax cuts just because Labor support them. Look, a couple of other things to comment on in this budget. Let's see if I can keep an eye on the commentary going on as we go. But before we do that, let's have a quick look at the actual budget bottom line. This is what we've got, budget bottom line here. The budget year, the one that they're setting the budget for, has a massive eye-watering deficit. I mean, there's been very little discussion of the size of the deficit, understandably, because it is huge, $42 billion. This is a peacetime deficit. This is a deficit when we're supposedly not in a recession. I mean, we can't have been, but Labor denies it. There's no big crisis, and yet we're running a $42 billion deficit, which is, as you see here, 1.5% of GDP. You see they include 2 years ago so that you can remember they once ran a surplus. But you can see there's a massive deficit this year and deficits as far as the eye can see looking forward, and no real sign of that improving. I mean, we are stuck in permanent deficit town now. It's it'll take a lot for us to ever see a sustained period of surpluses again, or even getting back to surplus, perhaps. I don't know if we're going to have a brave enough government in the next decade or so. But anyway, one interesting thing to note is what Labor has always been saying is that this is better than what the Liberals expect. And that's kind of true because 3 years ago, the Liberals were expecting this to be 1.6% of GDP deficit, and now it's a slightly better. So they're saying it's a slightly smaller deficit than what the Liberals expected. But this is smoke and mirrors from the Labor Party. It's very cheeky. I mean, both sides engage in this sort of bullshittery all the time. 3 years ago, Treasury just expected income tax revenue to be much lower. They were wrong. They just did bad modeling. Their model was wrong. And income tax revenue has gone through the roof. There's been a massive amount of bracket creep that clearly Treasury didn't know how to model. And so the federal government, through no credit to them, just sort of existed and got smacked in the head with tens of billions of extra tax revenue per year. Tens of billions, right? So that the budget should have massively improved on its own, massively. And you can see here, they're saying, oh, look, it's still about the same. We've marginally improved it. Yes, because you got tens of billions of dollars of just extra revenue you didn't expect, and you spent most of it. You didn't quite spend it all, so you can say, look, we've improved. But this idea that the budget is better than what we were given, look, you can't continue to live like that. I mean, these are massive deficits. Eventually, someone has to say, look, I'm not in it for the spin. I'm trying to cut the deficit. And clearly, Labor's not trying to cut this deficit. So the deficit is huge. It shouldn't be this huge. It's going to get worse. This is an ongoing macroeconomic problem. It's something that's not going to be able to be addressed until people realize, as I was talking about yesterday, what the main drivers of this runaway budget is. And unfortunately, it's all the things that are very popular: health spending, aged care spending, pension spending, things like that. But that's probably going to be beyond the capacity for our current politicians to be able to fix, I suspect, in the near term. By the way, congratulations, everyone. We get to celebrate $1 trillion of gross debt. Now, gross debt is the wrong measure, but still, it's a moment for us to celebrate. And how can I make little balloons pop up on the screen? They do that whenever I don't want them to. There you go. Thumbs up. We get to celebrate the fact that we've hit 1 billion. Not 1 billion, 1 trillion, 1,000 billion. It's 1,000 million. 1,000. A lot of money of gross debt. Gross debt's the wrong measure anyway, but there it is. Now, just jumping to a different tab here. If you're with me, this is okay. I'll put it on as a bigger screen. Yeah, Rob's very happy. Nice to make $1 trillion. Yeah, we can be very proud of our country now. Yes. This is the tax revenue split up by different types of tax. We talked about this one yesterday. As you can see here, most tax. So that the total tax here for this year, what is it? 676. Total revenue, 735 billion. These are in billion. 676 billion. Just that part is from tax, but then a big chunk of that is GST, which goes to the states, so it doesn't really count. So most of the tax is income tax in Australia. Income tax, either in individual income tax, company income tax, superannuation income tax, or petrol income tax, petroleum resource rent tax. And you can see those continue to go up. 500 billion, 520 billion, 550 billion, 570 billion. Yeah, there's no shortage in increase in income tax revenue going to the government for them to then hand around to whoever they need to hand it around to get elected. But you'll notice one of the things they mentioned, and it's in here, I wanted to bring this up so we could watch it, is the tobacco excise. So there you go. Tobacco excise, look, that number used to be well over 10. That used to be 11 or 12. And that's been consistently revised down so that, was it the last year that's ended, they pocketed just under 10 billion. This year, they're on track to get 7.4 billion. So it looks like 1/4 of all, more than, so that 30% of all smokers have stopped, or perhaps we should say they have stopped buying legal cigarettes. So yes, that is an issue. Obviously, the solution is just to decrease the excise and legalize vaping. If you legalize vaping, people would be coming off cigarettes. You could get excise on the vapes, but at the moment, we've just got this stupid policy of trying to encourage sort of organized crime. I mean, it's almost, the current policies would be easily explained by the fact that, by the idea that organized crime were giving kickbacks to the Labor Party to stay retarded and have policies that create a market for organized crime. Now, I'm not actually saying that's happened. It probably didn't happen. But if it did happen, it would be consistent with what we're watching. Yes, we've got our smartassery kicking in tonight. Surely because smoke rates are decreasing. Yes, that's clearly what it is. But now I was phasing in and out as they were giving the budget speech, so I didn't catch all of it. There was clearly a lot being spent on Medicare and healthcare, more money to the states. I mean, this is a pretty normal thing for Labor to do. Pretty much every budget, they say, I'm going to spend more on health. I'm going to try and fix health. They never fix health. And that's because the fundamental structures of how we run healthcare in Australia, I would argue, are broken. Let's just check to see who they've got here. Look, we can go back to this in a second if we find it interesting, but until we do. So that's pretty normal. Look, it's not what I want in a budget, but it's, look, the Liberal Party does that as well. They stand up and say, we're going to spend this on health and this on Medicare. So that's not a particularly exciting part of a budget in my mind. They're changing up the childcare system a little bit. Now, it looks like they're trending towards universal childcare, which is a terrible idea. But their main thing seems to be just guaranteeing everybody 3 days a week of childcare, which is still a daft idea. But realistically, people already had 2.5 days. Now, that's just, it was a bit more complicated how you get there, but it's not that hard to get 2.5 days of guaranteed childcare subsidy as it is. So that one, I guess, will sound good to their base and help them pick up lefty support without actually doing too much. So, meh. But one thing we talked about yesterday is how the government can hide some of their money off budget. And we did see a little bit of that in exactly two of the places that we talked about yesterday. So they did announce an equity injection into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and they did announce an equity injection into the NBN. So that's a bunch more money into these government businesses. And when the government transfers money from themselves into a government business and calls it an equity injection, it doesn't show up on the budget. It's nowhere. It's not in the fiscal balance. It's not in the underlying balance. And so they get to put that money over there. And then if that is ends up being spent badly, they also don't see that. So anyway, let's have a look at what the Greens are going to say about this.
They will flow to all taxpayers. It's not a huge amount, though. They'll amount to, I think it's about $10 a week once they're fully implemented. We heard the coalition say earlier they won't support them. What about the Greens?
Look, the Greens won't stand in the way of those measures, but this tiny tax tweak budget really is a missed opportunity to deliver real cost of living relief, like getting dental into Medicare. An extra 73 cents a day in 15 months' time isn't going to help that much when your rent has already gone up hundreds of dollars. And meanwhile, there continues to be over $50 billion in the budget for subsidies for fossil fuel industries, over $100 billion in subsidies for wealthy property investors. Like billionaires and big corporations continue to get handouts and support now, and everyday people are being asked to wait. And I heard the talk on your panel before about what to do about revenue. Well, under this budget, 1 in 3 big corporations pays no tax. Now, if we made those big corporations start paying their fair share of tax, we could fund things like dental into Medicare and give people relief now because people need it now.
Okay, but on these tax cuts, you said you won't stand in the way. Does that mean you won't try to amend them? At the moment, these are going to apply to the wealthiest of Australians. Does that concern you at all?
Look, if the government bowls this up as standalone legislation and isn't up for conversations about bringing it forward, then yes, we'll support it. But as I say, like really what is clear from this budget, where 1 in 3 big corporations continues to pay no tax, where the government didn't take up the Greens' offer to legislate and Dutton-proof measures to be able to see the GP for free and wipe student debt now, is that Labor this week has put, together with the Liberals, they've put corporations before the community. The big corporations continue to laugh all the way to the bank, with 1 in 3 of them paying no tax, and everyday people are being asked to wait. It's clear from this that with the coming election, we've got to keep Peter Dutton out. And the only way to get Labor to act, though, is having more Greens there to make these big corporations pay their fair share of tax to fund things like dental into Medicare.
So just quickly and finally, Adam Bandt, if we do see this election produce a hung parliament, are these more ambitious reforms you're talking about, particularly cracking down on the corporates? Is that something that you will be demanding?
Look, I think this coming election is the best chance in a generation to get the big corporations to pay their fair share of tax and fund things like dental into Medicare, mental health into Medicare, wiping student debt, ensuring that education is genuinely free in this country. These are the kind of real cost of living relief measures that, yes, we will be putting on the table in that minority parliament. Keep Peter Dutton out and get Labor to act on real cost of living relief.
Greens leader Adam Bandt, thank you.
Thanks, David.
Let's go now to the independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, joining us this evening. Thanks for your time.
Allegra has supported indexing tax brackets before to get rid of bracket creep, so this will be interesting.
Parliament, is this the sort of tax reform you were hoping to see?
Look, I wouldn't describe this as tax reform. I would describe this as a tax cut. And look, I want to see a reduction on our reliance on personal income taxes, but we have a long way to go to make this tax system really work for young people, for productivity, for businesses, as well as the climate transition.
We've heard from the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, this evening. The Coalition won't support these. He has left open the option of going to the election with a bigger tax package. Would you be encouraging or supportive of the Coalition doing something bigger on the tax front?
Look, I'd love to see broader reform. I know that we have an increasing reliance on income taxes, and to be fair to the Treasurer, this does partly address it, but nowhere near enough. And we have a broader issue that I think really comes out in terms of also for businesses, where our businesses are struggling to invest, they're struggling to innovate, and we really need to be investing in that area too. So, I welcome any tax reform that the major parties will work with, and I hope very much to work with them on these sorts of issues in the next parliament if I'm re-elected.
I mean, tax reform broadly sounds positive, and cutting taxes is the easy part of that. The harder part is, how do you pay for it? What's the part of reform where we raise the revenue to do these things, to lower those income taxes on working age Australians?
Oh, yeah, it has to be raising other revenue. We couldn't cut spending, says the ABC.
Green paper, and I say we do need to have all options on the table. But the reform I'm talking about also goes broader than just tax reform. There wasn't in this budget, I think, really enough in terms of driving productivity for our businesses. And I think this is where, we need to have EPBC reform that works for business as well as for the environment. We do need IR reform, and we need further reform in the construction sector, to make it cheaper and quicker to build construction. So there were some measures in there in the budget, but I think these are other areas of reform that we need to go much, much further in.
What about gas in our energy system? The Coalition's flagging they'll have something more to say before the election about trying to get more gas into the energy market. Climate change, big issue of your.
She seems like a sort of the teal that would potentially consider supporting a Liberal government. The way she talks about tax.
What we need to look at is transition for the next 10 years in particular, and work out how to do this in a way that is most reliable, but is also cheapest for our consumers, and at the same time starts to address our climate goals. So,
all right, I'm not interested to hear her talk about climate change. So, another one of the little policies that was mentioned, which is worthwhile just noting, they do this often. But it is interesting to note the Medicare levy. Now, the Medicare levy only kicks in once you start earning $26,000 a year. And then it kicks in at a 10% marginal rate, which is ridiculous, and they should get rid of the 10% marginal rate. I've been saying that to anyone who will listen, but no one seems to notice or care. If anyone understood what was happening, that we have a 10% marginal rate on many of the poorest people, and then down to 2% later, there'd be an outrage and they'd fix it, but no one seems to notice. They don't care. But anyway, they have increased that threshold. I am fascinated to hear what Jackie Lambie has to say about this. So let's find out in 1 second.
I don't know how many times we need to tell them. Any cuts that you are giving to us, if you're not means testing, whatever, can you imagine those billions of dollars that you've wasted on giving it to people like me? And there are millions of us out there that have got more than enough money, instead of putting that forward to those people who need that more. This is just disgusting. It is lazy. And quite frankly, I want all those rich people to know.
Jackie Lambie is more left-wing than the Greens now. She says that any tax cut that helps the rich, which is all of them because they all pay tax, should never happen. You must only just spend money on just hand out money to the poor instead. And she seems very outraged. So the world has gone upside down.
Here this week, Spearsy, we are talking about dirty, stinking salmon sitting in Macquarie Harbour, and yet that tax write-off for small businesses finishes on the 1st of July. Wouldn't you think we'd have
What is... Okay. I should try to be nice. What? I don't know. I don't know what we're looking at here. I think she's about to cry about salmon or something.
Are they telling me, Spearsy, I just want to make sure this is quite clear, that in the budget papers here that they were creating 25,000 businesses a month in 23-24. I want them to know that's about 300, and in the meantime we have 360,000 businesses go under. small business. So that's
All
where
right.
we're at. So it's really shocking.
I want to just pick up on one thing, and I was going to ask you about this, and you brought it up there, the salmon. This is an issue that the government's going to try to legislate here in Parliament this week before the election to protect the salmon industry in Tasmania from challenge under the EPBC Act.
All right, so it's all about the salmon, but yeah, I know. It's slightly more watchable if you see it as all part of some big cosmic joke that God is playing on us. It seems hard to believe that this is a person we're supposed to look up to as a leader and a parliamentarian in this country. Look, the reality is she may have balance of power soon. I mean, we should be. I don't know what to say. It's this is the world we live in. Good comments coming in here. Yes, what about the Crocs in finals? By the way, anyone listening along, if you have something smart or interesting to say, or even just want to cause trouble, pretend you have something smart or interesting to say and then cause trouble, go to my X page and you'll see the link to be able to come in here and join me. That's a very dangerous thing to do. Perhaps I shouldn't do it, but if you have something you wanted to say to the camera, then go to my x.com at John Humphreys 99, and then we'll just search for John Humphreys. Then you'll find the link to come in. Yes, well, not me. I'm not Tasmanian, but we have to be. I mean, I find it very hard to take her seriously. I mean, this idea that you means test tax cuts, you can't means test tax cuts. Then there wouldn't be tax cuts. It's they just apply to the people who pay tax. Like so. She's just saying she's against all tax cuts philosophically, right? So that's what she's effectively saying. She probably doesn't know she's saying that, but I mean, I keep catching myself because it's so easily for me to get frustrated and fall into saying not particularly nice things. She may have balance of power. It may be that you either need Jackie Lambie or the Greens to ever pass legislation. If Dutton wins, Lambie's might be his new best friend, but for some reason the Tasmanians just keep re-electing her, and that may well be relevant. So I'm not overly impressed with her intellect or ability to properly understand things, and then she just gets so annoyingly self-righteous as she half cries, half weeps, half yells at a camera, pretending that she's moral because of her ignorance. It seems like that's the moral virtue. It's always great to be yell cried at by people who don't really understand the policies, but are insisting that they're the only ones that do. So in other words, Anon, yes, scared. But we've seen here that Labor has put up it's small, it's moderate. They have done a bunch of other stupid things. I'm not a patsy for Labor. I spend a lot more time criticizing Labor than the Liberals. But first and foremost, we need tax cuts. No one else offered any. Labor offered some small, meek, moderate tax cuts. That's a step in the right direction. We want that. We want more steps in the right direction. You applaud it when they're going in the right direction. So that Labor has offered a small step in the right direction. And then the Liberals have said, no, we will oppose the tax cut. The Greens said, oh, yes, we'll support the tax cut. And Lambie's come out and said, we'll only support tax cuts if they're never a tax cut. So someone explain to me what world this is. Yes, she did. She gets very grumpy. Good news, just got a message from Brian. He says the percentage chance that the Liberals are going to embrace some of the ATA's tax cutting ideas, it's a slightly higher chance now after this budget. See if I can get him to come in. I think he's busy, but we'll see. Yes, no, Lambie wasn't a particularly generous person in spirit towards people who didn't want to have experimental vaccines. Yeah, you say it's the easiest, Senate. Look, I think we've discussed this before. It's done on percentages. So I don't know if it's easier to find, like, it's easier to run into 30,000 people in Tasmania, but it's also easier for your opponents to run into 30,000 people. If every time you speak to 10, you can convince one, then how does that make any difference whether you've got a lot of people or a few people? It's done on percentages. I've never understood this, saying you need fewer votes. That is true. But that also means your opponents need fewer votes, right? So it's, but anyway. Yeah, but in your state, you've just got a hell of a lot more people. So of course you're going to have more people supporting you if there's just a hell of a lot more people. Anyway, I shouldn't start arguing with people who can't talk back. Although, Rob, you can talk back. You could join. Jump on in. Tell me how I'm wrong. Now, Rob, I see your follow-up comment, but you should just join the chat and say it live to the camera. No, you're quite right. I don't think, well, I don't know. I think a lot of them just like her sort of, the fact that she cry yells, I don't know what to call it. So someone help me out with a word for that. Is there a word? Yell crying, cry yelling? She over emotionally, she emotes her anger at the screen, insisting that everyone else is a terrible person except her. I think some people interpret that for courage and leadership. And I think that appeals to some of the same people who admired Pauline Hanson's courage. And I think Pauline Hanson deserves that admiration somewhat more than Lambie. But I think there's some crossover between the people who vote Pauline Hanson and the people who vote Jackie Lambie. I see. I'll put that one up, Rob, but not your actual... You see, now you're agreeing with me. All right. See, so now you know deep down about these issues that I'm right, and now you just take that and apply it to the Senate numbers. Let's see, what else did I have in here? I was just finishing off the point that the Medicare levy threshold, that 26,000 before it kicks in, that has been pushed up. That's now 27,300 or something like 27.3. So the interesting thing to note about that is the Medicare levy, which is just an income tax. So let's call it the fake income tax. So the fake income tax threshold is effectively indexed. That's one of the things we've called for. Many other people have called for it. Allegra Spender, to her credit, has called for it. Indexing of the tax brackets to get rid of bracket creep, which is this automatic tax increase that the government sneaks through without any discussion, without any legislation. And one of the solutions is where you index the tax brackets. Our little fake income tax called the Medicare levy to trick people who think it's about Medicare, it's not. It's effectively indexed. They increase that threshold every year. Now, it happens every year, so it's not a particularly exciting announcement. They make it every year as if it's a new announcement. They do it every year, so it's nothing new. But it's good that they do it. And it means they've effectively indexed the Medicare levy thresholds, as they should. Do that with the rest of income tax, right? They do it with the fake income tax. Do it with the rest of the... yeah. So anyway, that's a little bit of good news, but it's not particularly new news. Look, all of the economic news is basically, I'm never that interested in it because the government doesn't control it in the short term. So that's fine. Inflation's in the band. That's fine. I mean, they didn't really do that. That's all I had notes for. All right. Well, I've gone long enough since this was supposed to be a watch. Actually, I was going to try one other thing. Now, I have no idea if this will work, and it's probably a daft idea. Let me see. Whoa. Okay.
Apologise if I.
Yeah.
Seals, right?
Yeah.
Look, the blue ribbon, liberal areas.
Right, I picked on
that
top
they
of
took,
another.
Right. They took it because of the Liberal Party and the National Party not being prepared of the Liberal Party and the National Party not being prepared to understand what people are really concerned about, right? And it's the same thing today.
Now, what I'm doing here is I'm piggybacking. There's another live stream. There's another X space going on at the moment, being run by Joel Jamal and his friends. Now, I didn't know he was doing this before I put mine up. And he's got a few people in there chatting. I saw that it was going on at the same time. And since I was just about to shut down anyway, I was going to go check what they had to say. But maybe we'll try this Inception and see if they can also watch this, if it just spirals and breaks the internet. But I was just going to listen along to see what sort of wisdom they had. And we'll see if we can learn anything from it. So join me.
Because I want to be, whether it be Labor or Liberal, I'm going to especially pick on Liberals for this. You sit there and you say that you support small businesses, but you push us overseas. You push people like me. Nobody. When I first left Australia, I was like 26, 27 when I first left. Okay. No 26 or 27-year-old Australian. I was born here. I was born in Western Australia. Nobody my age should ever leave this country because they think there's better opportunities overseas. That shouldn't happen. Now, there are some exceptions. If you're an actor or a singer or something, yeah, fair enough. But for someone like me...
I was hoping we'd actually get their commentary on to whether they... what their thought was. I have no way of asking them. This is a one-way importing them. And I don't know how cheeky this is. I know people doing an X space, piggybacking off another X space. I wonder how many times we could do that before we would sort of break the internet Inception style. I was hoping to actually catch what some other commentators in this space, their first reactions on this budget. Because, of course, this is actually, you know what? There's another thing that we need to look into about this budget that very remiss of me not to have looked at it already. I tell you what, let's have this so you guys can watch along at home as I run around the budget papers. So if you remember yesterday, budget paper 1, chapter 3 or statement 3, that gives you the overview of the fiscal outlook. I tend to skip the words and just look at the charts. Underlying cash balance, 42. We don't have the fiscal balance here. Well, let's find that out in a second. That's another good point. Look, government here is 26% of GDP. That's still that is eye-watering. That is nuts. Wait a second. That should be a headline here. Government spending, federal government only, so not including states, 27% of GDP. That is a lot higher than what it has been historically and what it should be. Hold the phone. Yeah, that's going to work my way up, higher up my order of complaints and commentary about this budget. That is a big number, right? So, as we said before, gross debt's made the trillion. Whoa, made the trillion. Net debt. Look, the correct number is net liabilities, but they don't put it here. That's not what I was after. I want to see the reconciliation. There we go. Reconciliation. From the last budget to the last MyEFO, they did that amount of new spending, whatever that adds up to. What 8 plus 8 says 17, roughly. 17 billion. But anyway, 8 billion in this year. In the budget year, 25-26, they already, in the last MyEFO, had put in another 8.2 billion, taking it. Oh, that's all policy decisions, right? Yeah. And then decisions here. Now that's interesting. Oh, yes, of course, the tax cuts are in the future. The tax cuts aren't in this budget year. So that's one thing. It's a bit annoying. I mean, I do appreciate they've done any tax cuts because I didn't expect they would. Of course, it's underwhelming. It's also not this year. So it doesn't start this year. So we have to wait for a bit. And effects of policy decisions. So they have, of course, they've spent more money. $20 billion. So that's the easy takeaway. $7 billion new spent. So of this $42 billion deficit, it would go straight down to 35 if they could just do nothing. If they could just sit on their ass for a bit. And you see the total parameter variations. This is the thing they don't control. So the thing they don't control has improved the budget by 12 billion. And the thing they do control made the budget worse by 7 billion. And then they say, look how well we improved the budget. Yeah, that's That's not very honest. But anyway, so this is one of the numbers I always go to. The effect of policy decisions from this budget in payments. That is the amount of extra discretionary spending just for this year that they've announced just in this budget, which isn't ideal. It's one of my constant bugbears, one of the things I always go back to and will continue to go back to. So that's all right. So we should find out the receipts policy decisions. This is the tax cut. It's a very dishonest way they report tax cuts as well. Look, I think the honest way of reporting it is once it's fully implemented, they say it's worth $6 billion. Now, I've costed the exact same thing. My model says it's worth about $5.2 billion or something. So the difference is that my model factors in behavioural change. Treasury doesn't have a model. It has a child playing with crayons. It is so embarrassing that they are given credibility and credence by our mainstream media. They don't factor in behavioural change. They don't even try to. I don't know if they're going to start trying to. I think they've started pretending that they do, just to trick gullible journalists, but you scratch the surface and then they don't. There is a pretty simple way to factor in behavioral change in a tax model using a parameter called the elasticity of taxable income, and they just don't do it. I suspect they didn't know what it was until I told them about it a couple of years ago, and now they still aren't using it. But it's embarrassing. Treasury doesn't do real modeling. Our media continues to take Treasury seriously, and so they always estimate tax cuts incorrectly. But the real price is $6 billion a year. They've just then added together several years. That's how they get to 17, which is just daft. Don't add together several years. It's just misleading. ATO is going to go after more people. Great. That's sarcasm. Pausing indexation on draft beer excise and excise equivalent cuts. Wait a second. I did hear him say something about alcohol. Is there a beer tax cut? Wait a second. Now, it's not really a tax cut. It's a stopping a tax increase, but they have automatic tax increases on a lot of the excises. They do this on petrol. They do this on cigarettes. Pausing indexation. This is the one I'm looking at. On draft beer excise and excise equivalent customs duty rates for a 2-year period. What available under there? Pre-election budget, and Labor has gone for cheaper beer. I love it. I love it. Anyway, just randomly now, Dave, right now, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, you're coming through fine. Well, you just I didn't see you sneak in the back room there. I was off looking through the budget papers, discovering that pre-election budget, Labor has gone for cheaper beer.
That's all. I just heard that you're doing like a proper serious deep dive on actual real numbers versus my high level ranting that I was doing on my channel.
Well, I saw you were doing it, and I actually opened in the background. But since I was live on air, I couldn't have the sound on because that would be very awkward for me. So I only saw your face. You were getting very animated, but I have no idea what you said.
I was drinking scotch and getting angry about attacks on men and families and all kinds of things hidden in the budget, or not so hidden when the special women's specific papers that they have. But tell
me more. Right? So,
well, I mean the fact that there's 4 budget papers, and then there's a special women's budget statement, and they start off the top line entry there is about gender-based violence. And they're sort of spending billions on gender-based violence, continuing to denigrate men and toxic masculinity and go down that path. But the thing that really got me was the next column across, where I still have it open on my screen just so I can read the line. Here it is. There's one line I got hung up on, which was, women continue to shoulder most of the unpaid care in Australia, which undermines women's lifelong economic security. So they got me on a whole rant around, the undermining of marriage as a stable foundation of, the conservative point of view, conservative foundation of society, and the fact that they're just sort of saying that, generally in a loving, caring marriage, you have economic security. Like nothing's being undermined by having a working partner who funds and provides and looks after you. And to say that shouldering most of the unpaid care, as if women don't want to be mothers and don't want to look after their kids. Just all the layers in that one sentence that's at the top of the women's budget statement. I was like, give me strength. But anyway, that was just
I was very rudely using that moment to just quickly type this up to point everyone towards your X channel, which I thought was polite, but then I realized halfway that I was being impolite because I wasn't listening to you. What was the quote that you had at the front of that one?
Women continue to shoulder most of the unpaid care in Australia, which undermines women's lifelong economic security.
Undermines their life. Yes, because the sneaky assumption in that is you can only have. It's interesting for me to say this as a libertarian, but it's a very individualistic view of the world, that you can only have security as an individual. You can never have security by banding together with other people you love.
Right.
It's the difference between believing in individual rights and believing that atomized individualism is the only way to live your life, which I believe in individual rights very strongly. I don't believe atomized individualism is a coherent or an intelligent way to live your life at all. You live together with people, you come together with people, and you can get economic security by coordinating with the trifecta I always go back to: family, church, community. And they're saying, oh, no, some women are successfully able to find family, church, and community for stability. Isn't that terrible? They have to go and work at Mr. McGillicuddy's factory making widgets. That's the only way to have real security. So,
and it says, we're expecting that you won't stay with your husband forever. If you get married and want to raise a family, the expectation is that will break down and you will need economic security independent of that familial relationship, because clearly that's not going to last, because we instituted things like no-fault divorce 40 years ago. So you can walk away whenever you like. And of course you will. And in which case you need to have your own superannuation. You need to have been working in the factory building widgets for the last 40 years. No widgets. That's work for the toxic men. You should be doing the higher paid jobs for equality reasons. They're just
full equality. They could be garbos.
I mean, there is a whole thing in there around the gender disparity in different jobs. So I think we're going to see a lot more women as in sanitation and bricklaying soon.
Which seems very equal. Now, you've only just got here, but at the same time, my normal offsider, Brian, has entered the backstage. So I'm also going to bring him on, see if we can get three of us on here without always talking over each other. I still want to get your general take, your general summary of the budget, other than the battle of the sexes part. But let's just bring Brian in for a second. Comrade Brian, how goes it?
Oh, yeah, good.
You having fun with this budget?
Coalition.
So what's your take? What's your takeaway now? What's happened?
Well, Labor's outflanking the coalition when it comes to tax cuts. Now, they're shitty tax cuts and they're kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But it's not about that, right? It's political messaging. And Labor's gone out there and they've said, we're going to cut taxes. Again, we're going to cut taxes twice, right? And the feedback loops I was receiving was sort of hesitancy to touch our sort of family tax cuts policy, and well, we need to balance the budget, and things are looking pretty dire, and maybe we can't afford that. And the Labor Party's just completely rat-fucked them and gone, oh well, deficits don't really matter because we're just going to do some retail politics and we'll figure it out later, further down the track. And it's easy for us to have these discussions and be like, well, if you cut taxes whilst raising spending, you kick the can further down the road and future generations are going to have to pay that back. That doesn't matter in an election, right? What matters in an election is people are hearing right now, Labor will cut taxes. And I put a post up on X just before Labor's budget speech, the coalition were at, let me bring it up, $1.72 in the betting odds to form government, with Labor at $2.10. Labor are now at $1.80 with coalition at $2, right? Because messaging works. It works, and the coalition literally just need to do what they're allegedly good at, which is giving more money back to Australians. So this isn't fucking rocket science. Cut family taxes. It's very simple. And slash migration, but that's separate.
Yeah, it's not rocket surgery or brain science. No, but
that's right.
What is now? I don't think that Labor saw my article today and went and quickly changed their budget. Their budget was already printed, but it was somewhat fortuitous. I put out this article. It was published on Spectator Australia this morning. And in it, I was basically pitching for Liberals, for the love of God, take one of these ideas. I understand you're scared of big tax reform. Here's a series of little tax reform. Something you can do that is something. And I gave them a list. And then twice in there, I said, by the way, it's theoretically possible that a Labor Party, if they were smart, would come in and take one of these ideas. Some of these ideas would work for a Labor Party. If the Liberals are sitting on their hands, Labor Party could swoop in, take one of these ideas and wrong foot the Liberals. Exactly one of my ideas was cut the bottom tax rate by a couple of percent.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they've done. They do it because they read my article, because they'd written the budget before I wrote my article. But
Jim
I'm
Chalmers
going to
was
take credit
really
anyway.
respectful yesterday, and just went, quick, put that in right now. No. Look, but again, like, this isn't 15-dimensional underwater backgammon, right? It's very fucking simple, which is give money back to Australians. And I think that, the Labor Party spent the last few months soft signaling different election campaign promises and like signaling like different handouts. And, we're going to build a bazillion hospitals in, Western Sydney and all these sorts of things. And none of those things have moved the dial. So someone in the party's smart enough to realize that actually maybe if you just tell them that you'll give some of their money back to them, they'll like that.
Well, also just
sure,
politically, it's just wrong foots the Liberals
ABC
wonderfully.
saying that, well, Angus Taylor was on ABC saying that it's, equivalent to 73 cents a day. Yeah, that's correct. I'm not suggesting that these are huge tax cuts that are, game changers. But when it comes to political messaging, Labor's just gone out of the gates and said, we're going to cut taxes. And it's completely flanked the coalition. And now the coalition need to cut taxes even harder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the good things about this is if the Liberals had any sense, they would have owned this issue already. They would have already announced a tax cut bigger than Labor could do anything with. Labor wouldn't even bother competing in this space. The Liberals would own, we are the productivity reform tax cutting party. Instead, they sat on their hands. Labor's taken the lead now. The Liberals have to beat it. And even when they beat it, they're going to get less credit because the Labor Party moved first.
Yeah, because they'll be viewed as following the Labor Party into the position, right? And then what?
Now, I was in two minds about this, Brian. Maybe you can help me out because you speak to these people. I said earlier, I think it's 50-50 whether the Liberals actually were sitting on a tax cutting policy that they were just waiting later to announce, and 50% that the next 48 hours, all of the Liberal boffins are pulling an all-nighter. They're just hopping up on amphetamines and cocaine for 48 hours and trying to find a tax cutting policy that is better than Labor's so they can justify not supporting Labor's and say, we're going to do this all along. Which do you think it is? Are they scrambling now, or did they have something in their back pocket?
No, I think that they had something in their back pocket. I don't know what level of tax cut it is. But, political 101, you need to signal this stuff. Like,
hopefully they steal our policy.
The problem now is they're going to be seen to be following Labor's lead on this issue, right? And they'll be seen to just be saying, we'll do what they do, but one more. And it doesn't, even if...
unless they grow up here and actually bring proper tax reform to the table. But that's the alternative, right? And do it properly.
Yeah, it needs to be huge.
Yeah.
They can't go, Labor's cutting milk taxes by 73 cents per day, so we'll cut it by 80 cents per day. It needs to be massive. And what we were suggesting was, what we considered within the Overton window to be pretty massive, right? Increasing the tax-free threshold for $10,000 for every kid you have. Income splitting for single income earners. To encourage, stay-at-home parents and all that kind of stuff. Like, the policy solutions are out there. And if you wanted to, how do I explain this? If you wanted to own the narrative, I agree with John. What you should have been saying is, we'll be announcing tax cuts. You don't have to say what, right? We'll be announcing tax cuts. We're going to give money back to Australian families. We're going to help them out in a cost of living crisis. And it's not going to be a handout. It's going to be them keeping more of their own money. That's all you have to say. So if the Labor government then comes out and says, we'll slash taxes too, you've already fucking set the narrative. Now it's completely reversed. I heard the ABC journo say to Jim Chalmers, she said, where is it? I wrote the quote down. She said, have you stolen Peter Dutton's thunder here? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I laughed. I was watching along when that happened, and I laughed along and said yes at that point. So anyway, Brian, when you came in, I'd only just brought Dave in. I don't actually know Dave from a bar of soap because we've chatted a bit through X, and I've seen some of your work, but we don't really know each other. But we're going to pretend like we do here for the viewing public at home. Dave, I didn't actually get your hot take. What's your summary of this budget? How awesomely shitty or terribly awesome is it?
It's billions. Billions, I think, is the key word for this budget, because that is what they kept. That was the refrain they kept throwing out there. Billions for this and billions for that and billions. This is the pork barreling budget of the decade. That's what this is. This is just throwing money out there, as far as I can tell. I went on my live stream saying, I'm going to do a drink game. Whenever they say something's free, I'm going to drink. I had to switch it to billions, because they didn't call stuff free. They just talked about the billions and billions of dollars, because I wasn't getting any drinks. I was like, come on, I want to drink my scotch. I had to switch it to billions, and then I was like, doosh, 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 doosh. So I've had a few sips of scotch tonight already. So if I'm animated or
well, I ran through this just before you guys got here, but if you're interested, which you're probably not, but please fake it while I'm here.
Of course, no. I'd love the proper erudite discussion on the numbers.
Well, this has got the reconciliation. This actually shows how much news, because they say billions a lot, but as I mentioned on Monday, there's ways for them to just park that money off budget, and they've done that a couple of times here. But just look at this is the reconciliation between last time. So they did their last budget, a mini budget at the end of last year.
MyEFO.
This is just a few, the MyEFO. So just from MyEFO, when they thought this budget was going to be at a $47 billion deficit and coming in slightly better, it's coming in better because they just got smacked in the ass with a revenue rainbow that they had nothing to do with. So that's very nice for them. What did they do with it? They have, here it is. They've spent $7 billion. So they just 12 billion fell from the sky this year. Now, all the other commentators, they like to add up over 4 years, which I think is a ridiculous way of giving information, because that's not how humans think. I'm generally trying to speak to humans. So just in 1 year, they got smacked in the ass with $12 billion of money they didn't expect. Did they give us it back in tax cuts? Well, no, not this year. They did in the future a little bit, but no tax cuts. This is the tax number. It's basically zero. Did they pocket it to pay off the deficit? Not really. $7 billion in new spending just in the last couple of months. So that's often a number I always go back to in these budgets. It's not very sexy, but it tells you just the constant drip feed of government spending. And you'll find this every budget, Liberal, Labor, always go, every budget, there will be a big number there in the billions of new spending that was unnecessary and just new spending you came up with in the last few months to fuck up this budget. And there will always be a number in the billions just sitting in that column for people to cry about.
But so many people are ingrained into the fact that the government has to have money to give out for things. And that we need to pay high taxes in order for the government to have things. Like there's people out there, a lot of Australians, I think, that are ingrained in that. I was talking to a friend of mine around government grants for not-for-profits and things like that. And he was saying, but if we didn't have as much taxes, then we wouldn't be able to get these grants to do things as an organization. I was like, what if people just didn't pay as much tax and had more money to give directly to the organizations like they used to in the olden days? But it's such a hard
The other
concept,
killer here
isn't
is the other killer is this $7 billion. It's just new discretionary spending. So there were grants to NGOs already in the budget rolling forward. So even if they didn't have this $7 billion, there'd still be billions of stupid grants being wasted on bullshit, like
but just want to talk about big
dance
tax
theory or
reform.
what have you.
But just to add to this point, right? Like, these are sort of small drop in the ocean figures, but they're representative of how politicians just abuse your money and just start pissing it up against the wall. So $3.8 million to help pandas at Adelaide Zoo. Doesn't say how it's going to help them, but we're going to help them. So, pandas, $3.8 million. $165 million to train police. Okay, maybe that's good if you're pro, being tough on
Fellas,
crime.
don't get alarmed. I'm just dropping down for a second.
Yep. So $165 million to train police. If you're pro law enforcement, maybe that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh wait, it's to train police in the Solomon Islands. So not going to Australian police, not benefiting the Australian communities. It's going to the Solomon Islands. $36 million to build a new embassy in Kiev. $17 million for more weapons and gear to send white people to go die in ditches in Ukraine. Like, again, these are all rounding errors. But it's representative of just this lazy approach. They don't care.
You sound like Elon Musk going through these figures. The stupid shit they've come up with. You should be our Elon Musk.
Right? Attempt at dodging.
And the other thing, and you talked about outflanking the opposition on the new power relief thing, the $150. So they lied to us about the $275. They never delivered actual cheaper energy generation, so the power companies would charge us less money. So they tried to say, all that money we've stolen off you, we'll give you $300 back of it, and that's our power price relief. Oh, look, there's an election coming up. People have forgotten that we gave you $300 last year. We're going to give you another $150. And I think it was Jane Hume on Sky this week. She's going, oh, well, we won't stand in the way of Australians getting much needed relief from cost of living. And I'm like, this is the issue that now the opposition just goes, okay, we'll sign that off because, we're helping Australians. And coming this close to a campaign, how can we not say yes to giving money back to Australians? Because that's just going to bite us hard on a campaign.
You're right. No one wants to prosecute arguments and go, if I was in the coalition and I heard that, Labor government's going to give $150 towards power bills, I'd be arguing the point and saying, well, hang on, they've gone up by X amount. And instead of yet another handout that's not going to solve the issue, we're just going to actually allow, coal and gas plants to reopen and reduce power costs, right? Like we used to have the cheapest energy costs in the OECD, and now we don't. And there's a reason for that, which is that we decided that we wanted to build, wind farms and solar panels and get rid of actual proper ways to generate energy. So you need to be willing to own those arguments. And there just seems to be hesitation, and it just seems to be, okay, well, Labor's doing a handout. We'll do that handout too, but slightly different. Labor's doing a tax cut, so we'll also
they won't prosecute. They won't take a stand and go, you know what, this is wrong in principle, and so they'll try and stitch us up and say, oh, they oppose this thing, but we actually have principles that we hold to, and we believe that no, giving that money back in tax relief is a bad plan because we should just be actually having better policy that lowers costs. Let's do proper tax management relief and actually reduce overall taxes rather than these handouts. Let's write better policy and let's compete on actual real ideas versus just sort of going, oh, well, we don't want to be the ones that stood in the way of that thing because then they'll bash us in the media. The media is massively complicit on this as well in the way they report.
The journalists who hate us will attack us even harder. It's like,
good. And even like away from pure budget stuff, like Dutton at the Lowy Institute last week, I covered this on my channel, that he got pinned up for the limp wrist comment, right? That was all the headlines you saw about Dutton at Lowy Institute. It was all about Albo and the limp wrist. But if you actually listen and read through any of the transcripts and comments, that was a solid, meaty speech around foreign policy and defense spending and sovereign capability of manufacturing and so on. You go, there were some really good points for Dutton to stand on in that speech that the media completely ignored because they got all hung up on this limp wrist thing. And so how are the general populace meant to know that when the opposition differentiate themselves if they just talk about crap identity politics stuff instead of actual meat and potatoes?
You know what? That was a fucking failure by the coalition as well, right? The journos tried to turn that into an issue, and they immediately cucked and they immediately apologized. You should have just been like, it is limp wristed, full stop. You know what?
Yeah.
Double down. Call someone a faggot.
They're living in the old world. We discussed this before. The old rules were that you had to pander to this center, and the mainstream media controlled the center. And I think that did used to be the rules, but it's not the rules anymore. Sure. I mean, that we've shown this in Le Pen, AFD, Farage, Trump. We're seeing it in every country of the world except ours, pretty much. Kind of New Zealand and Canada's gay as well, but it's happening everywhere, and we're still caught up in this old mentality. And you can see it's still very much what the insiders and the decision makers in the Liberal Party believe, that they still have to play by this old rule. Look, I want to say one thing just quickly on the Labor's tax cuts, because Dave, we were both doing our live streams at the same time. You wouldn't have seen my take. I think it's important we give them credit for this. Now, I've seen a lot of commentary coming in saying, the tax cuts aren't big enough. They're bigger than zero, which is what I expected from Labor, and it's what Liberals have given so far. I mean, and that's the way. If you say you can't afford big tax cuts, then I'd say, all right, well, at least give us small tax cuts. It's better than nothing. And then if we get a step in the right direction, it is kind of petty and partisan bullshittery to say, oh, that's not good enough. Then we say, thank you. Good step in the right direction. Keep stepping. Like the rest of your budget's basically bullshit, and this tax cut is too small, but well done for doing one thing that wasn't wrong. You get a pat on the back for that. You get 1 star, which is better than 0 stars. And we shouldn't then say, oh, that's not a good enough tax cut. Well, we didn't expect anything from them. So
sometimes we've got to play the game of inches, right?
Yeah, right.
Well, it's better taking an inch in the right direction than an inch in the wrong direction.
And use that to turn around to the coalition and say, you guys need to get at least 3 stars if you want to win this narrative back. But they've put themselves in a corner now, because I'm just going to pull numbers out of my ass. Let's say that the Labor's given $5 billion worth of tax cuts over the next 12 months, whatever the number is. The Liberals need to now, because they weren't the ones leading this charge, and they weren't the ones calling for this, and they weren't the ones that were setting their brand to the tax cut issue. They now need to give tax cuts that are so huge in order to win the debate again that I just can't see them doing that. So,
or narrative changing. I mean, that's why this is interesting, Brian, because I mean, the idea, we put out a series of ideas, Dave, over the last couple of weeks, 1 or 2 a week, and we will be up until the election, just sort of tax reforms inside the Overton window. Now, I've for decades been giving tax reforms well outside the Overton window, like abolish income tax, abolish the government. That's fun. I like radical ideas. I gave myself a harder task. Yeah, I gave myself a harder task this election cycle, which is to try and come up with policies that could theoretically be stolen by a major party, which clearly I've succeeded somewhat in that Labor has done exactly one of the things I suggested. But there's a series of ideas. Now, Brian, God bless him, has only heard 1 or 2 of the ideas that I've suggested, because only the ones relating to families. And Brian is quite good at working the corridors of power down in Parliament, and that's why,
I heard the other ones. I just have selective hearing, and
yes. But a couple of the ones we've got is, as he mentioned before, increasing the tax-free threshold by $10,000 for each child you have. And the other one is allow families the option of filing their tax jointly with a $50,000 tax-free threshold. If they choose that. I mean, they don't have to, they could choose not to, but if they choose that, then now both of these, they're significant changes. They don't cost much more. Like this $7 billion, I just showed you the $7 billion in 1 year that Labor has blown in this budget, just in the last couple of months, announced $7 billion of discretionary spending. The that $10,000 tax-free threshold increase, that's now affordable. That would have been, that's about the same, depending how you do it. That costs somewhere between 4 and 8 billion. That's pretty close to 7. So these changes, now, yes, ideally they would just blow Labor out of water with the size of their tax cuts, but they could change the narrative by doing something a bit different, like family tax cuts, where you can make a very big difference to a smaller cohort of society. Not everyone has kids.
I think One Nation are pushing that kind of policy idea as well, right?
Yeah, they've got income splitting, which is a nice idea. Yeah, income splitting. Yeah, so I'm all for income splitting. I set myself the goal of trying to make this inside the Overton window. So I was trying to come up with family tax cuts.
Do you think that's too big? You think there'd be too much pushback against combined income?
Well, I could predict the inevitable response, because the inevitable response is already there. You can just see what everyone's already said previously when Matt Canavan's put it up, is that income splitting is going to give this bigger benefit to people the richer they are. So I tried to frame similar pro-family tax cutting policies in a way where it the most of the benefits everyone. Rich people get some of the benefit, but they don't get a much bigger benefit.
Yeah, the way I frame the income thing, and I've done the maths on this as well, is you got one person earning 120K, which is not like change the world money. It's above average salary, right? I think in nowadays 120K, they get taxed at the moment. Their take home after pay is 90, so they get taxed 30K of their 120. If you had 2 people in the same household earning 60 each or whatever to get 120K as a family, they together pay tax only 20K. They walk away with 100. So by having someone dedicated to stay at home, whatever,
I'm all for the idea of income splitting. That's very much what we're echoing with the idea of allowing a family to have a $50,000.
That's just yeah.
That's very much what we achieve with a. Just give me a second on this one. So that's very much what we achieve with a $50,000 combined tax-free threshold. I mean, that mimics a lot of the benefits of income splitting. And it's a way that some countries do income splitting. But by just changing the tax-free threshold instead of the other brackets, you're not actually giving a bigger benefit. So everything you said is true, but you could do the exact same story with someone on 1.2 million instead of 120,000. And under pure income splitting, they do get a significantly bigger tax cut. And it would be a very easy criticism the Liberal Party if they do this. So I was just trying to preemptively give them a policy that was automatically defended against that. So this has the same, basically the same tax cut for everybody once they earn above 50,000. Whether you're rich or poor, you're all getting a tax cut, but you're all getting roughly the same. You're not getting a much bigger tax cut if you're rich. And I thought that might make it a bit closer to the Overton window, make it a bit easier for the good guys in the Liberal Party to sell to the squishy wet rags in the Liberal Party and maybe get it over the line. So, but anyway, these ideas, they're radical enough without blowing the budget. The Liberals might actually being backed into a situation, Brian, where the only thing that makes sense for them is to take on some of these ideas, right? Because that idea is noticeably different enough. You're muted, Brian.
I did the thing and muted myself. Yeah, I mean, you would think so, but I don't know. Like, I mean, I've been saying for the last few weeks now that the coalition campaign team needs to just step back and let, Peter and some of the leadership team just run their campaign like they were last year, which is what got them to build up their support base. And if that were the case, then yeah, I would say that the likelihood of that happening would be pretty big, because I think that they would see what's happening. They would see that they're being outflanked, and they would be willing to just go, you know what, if we want to win this election, we're going to, go balls to the wall and throw out some proper tax reform. But there's this lingering, the same views, the same mindset that says you can't be mean to journalists, because we all still want to get invited to Jane Caro's fucking dinner party. The same mindset within the coalition that wants to get invited to dinner parties with left wingers will be sitting there going, well, no, we're the party of balancing budgets and we don't want to take anything too extreme. So just give them whatever Labor's offering plus one. It's not enough now, because you've completely lost the narrative. You've completely lost all the messaging. So unless you're willing to go, they're offering tax cuts, but it's nothing. And the reason we're saying it's nothing is because we're going to fucking give you so much back, you're not going to know what to do with it.
Well, they've backed themselves into that now, because they've said they're not going to support Labor's tax cuts. So if they're not supporting Labor's tax cuts, they have to come out with
they're going to cut taxes,
better,
right? So,
yeah, and bigger and better somehow.
So take it to the bank. They're going to announce tax cuts. I'm suggesting that if their tax cuts aren't fucking massive, and that's a technical term, if their tax cuts aren't fucking massive, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to be scared of flowing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the issue the Liberal Party have is there's too many lefty Marxists in there, and that's undermining who they're supposed to be. And so but let's go to things like the energy policy and the 275 and coal. They can't go heavy on coal because they're still tethered to Paris and net zero because of the lefty factions. And even, I don't know, maybe in closed doors, Dutton would love to push coal, and he would love to be able to renounce all the net zero stuff and bring Canavan into his cabinet, but Canavan won't join the cabinet while net zero is a policy. And because they've got the Marxists in there sort of pushing them down these lefty paths, Dutton's can't take a hard stand on these things for risk of losing party leadership. So he's like, I better just play the line and so I can stay in power. Hopefully once if he can get into power as the PM, then that gives him a bit more carte blanche to say, screw you lefties, and actually bring who he is. But unfortunately, I don't think we're seeing who Dutton is apparently supposed to be, because he's just trying to hold the reins for a few more months.
Yeah, I mean, once polling starts shifting and betting markets start shifting, you do tend to find that people say, "Nah, get out of my way. We're now going to run a proper campaign." But it can't be too little, too late. The thing I've been warning against for a while is that if you run this kind of offend no one, just try and there's this push to make Dutton tame, and it's Dutton has always been hated as the evil potato Hitler guy that we're all meant to hate, and it didn't work. It never really stuck, and then the only people that still call him a potato are insane leftists that no one cares about, right? So you didn't need to tame him. People kind of liked what I call Dark Dutton. And he was building his brand around that last year. And then there was just this push to tame him. And it's we'll have slow-mo footage of him at a beach with a puppy, and he'll hold roses, and he'll convince affluent female city voters, who have cats, that he's actually, really nice. It's well, they're not convinced by that. They don't believe that. Everyone knows that he's Dark Dutton. So just go with what he is. Let him be who he is, and he'll probably win on that. So I think,
although just
if I was a betting man, I think there'll be some really hard conversations being held right now saying we need to do something. Now, what will win out, we won't find out till Thursday, right? But my hope is that they go, all right, massive tax cuts, and they need to be fucking huge.
I would love huge tax cuts. I think they are going to be spooked by blowing too big a hole in the budget. Keep in mind that the current budget deficit for the budget year is 42 billion, which is, that's if you're in a war, or if you're in a pandemic or a GFC kind of level budget deficit. And we've just sort of pranced into it and said, oh, look at that, 42 billion. Oh, well, anyway, pass the chips. It's going to be tricky for them. I don't think it matters too much if you tweak it up a little bit or a little, it needs to go down, but all right, they could Liberals could be 44. I don't think that matters. I don't think they want it to be 70 or 80, right? So it's that becomes beyond the capacity to justify. So I think they have to have a tax policy that blows the Labor Party's tax policy out of the water, but it can only cost revenue a bit more. That would be the parameters I put it. But I think we've got that. We have given them ideas. They are already there. They're in the Specky article. They're in all of our chats. You can give people an extra $10,000 tax-free threshold. That sounds big. That is meaningful. It is big. It doesn't go to everyone, and it goes to people with kids. But that is a big thing that is achievable. There are other things they could do. They could easily put the tax-free threshold up to $24,000 instead of the current $18,000. Make a few other little tweaks. Use it to replace LETO and a few things like that. Most people won't understand that. It doesn't cost the budget that much. You could then also increase the threshold for the top marginal tax rate. So it should be cut, but I know it's going to be too hard to cut because major parties are all bedwetters, limp-wristed, you could say. So let's say they keep the 47%, but it only kicks in at $500,000. That only costs the budget $500 million. That is a rounding error. That's because they don't raise much money from the top marginal tax rate. As people have heard me say before, the top marginal tax rate only exists so politicians can prove to voters how much they hate rich people, so the voters will like them. But they could do like 4 of our policies combined at a price only a little bit more than Labor's policies have been. It doesn't blow the budget out, and it would look impressive if they do it smart. And thankfully, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance has been out there already providing smart ideas, which is why everyone should go to taxpayers.org.au, become a member. Up the top right corner, membership button, go in there, couple of bucks a month, keeps the lights on over here. So that's my pitch. And I'm sure Dave agrees. As endorsed by Dave on the spot to a person I don't really know, throwing him under the bus. Dave says, come and join the Taxpayers Alliance so that we can keep the lights on.
Dave right now says, if there are content creators out there and you enjoy and get value out of their work, you should be supporting them.
And there's Dave right now. Go to X.
Well, I mean, we've sort of been talking within the Overton window on like normie tax reform, within the normie parties. But I don't know, like, what are we estimating would cost again for just the $10,000? The increase in the tax-free threshold by $10,000? Like what?
If you apply it to all dependents, about 8. Which is doable. They could just do that.
Right. So let's just say $8 billion a year, right? And you just do that. Just as like proper, like hardcore pitching to Conservatives, rebuild the base, get your disaffected Liberals back, and win a proper right-wing mandate and actually have a mandate. If Peter Dutton rolled out on Thursday and said every single dollar that goes towards fucking wind and solar, we're pausing it, that's X billion dollars a year, and every single dollar from that we're giving back to Australian families. Done.
Right. It's the Doge factor. I mean, John, you're talking about, we don't want to blow a hole in the budget, so we can't give people too much tax back because we need to keep revenue levels at a certain level. How about we reduce the spending level and actually say we don't need as much? We can shrink government. We can have a smaller government. They're already on record saying they want to wipe out the 36,000 new public servants and so on. But where do we
look?
do that?
I agree with you that you don't need to convince me of that. I'm just trying to put my mind in the Liberal Party shoes and think what we could sell them. I think what we've been trying to sell them is extremely sellable now, is my point, because they can't just it can't just be bigger because they can't afford it. It has to be smarter, and we've got those ideas out there. Look, I agree they should be slashing spending, but I mean, I'd say that. I mean, the main drivers of our runaway growth in spending, a lot of people say slash spending, cut, cut waste. You go through the budget. The main drivers by far, we did this yesterday, is the age pension. You're going to cut that. Medicare, you're going to cut that. Public hospitals, you're going to cut that. Disability pension, NDIS. So it's basically disabled and old people, and then aged care. So I think that's like the top 4, top 6. And that makes up the vast majority of the budget. Now, I think we should reform all of those to do them more thoroughly differently and decrease the amount of government spending. I don't imagine that either of the major parties are about to go to an election saying, vote for me, I'm cutting Medicare and the age pension. I just don't think they're going to do that.
Well, NDIS is the big blowout one, right? Like, how can they go in with a meaningful plan to address the NDIS blowouts and the rorting that goes on in there, where providers are charging 4x what they should be?
No, because everyone gets feelings. Like you can point to the most egregious examples and be like, well, we're paying like NDIS carers to get hand jobs in Thailand or something like that, right? Like really insane stuff that shouldn't exist but does.
Don't you care about Thailand? I mean, the Thai industry needs some demand, right? That's cruel of you. Look, I would love them to make the case. I would love them to make the case that the entire welfare bureaucratic state has fucked up Western civilization. I would love to see that as a part of the political discussion. I just think, to quote Howard, who's not one of my political heroes, but you can't fatten the calf on market day. They haven't put the groundwork in for that yet. So look, we should make that case, and we will make that case, and I do make that case, and as does David and Brian. They should just be massively cutting spending, massively cutting tax, balancing the budget.
The whole indigenous rot industry. Let's address that as well, and that whole rot that is the indigenous industry, and all the money that gets thrown, good money after bad, to incentivize people to not work and to get drunk in remote communities. I know there's more complexity to that, but I mean there's plenty of clear examples where that is happening in many places, which is not creating better outcomes, but under the name of white guilt and the racism of low expectations, we're just going to keep spending billions on programs that are proven to not work. But as soon as you say intervention or any of those Howard era things where he was trying to make some of those changes for better or worse, cashless debit cards, etc., it's like, oh, you racist bigot, you can't do that.
See, I think they could make progress on one of these issues, but I think it probably requires enough political commitment. Like, I think if they just dived into fixing the Aboriginal industry and just made that their priority while giving us a bunch of sweeteners like tax cuts or whatever, I think it's doable. I mean, it needs the political bravery that we don't have today. They're probably not going to be able to do all of them at once. And keep in mind, the Aboriginal industry, I mean, we shouldn't be spending the money on it. But if you abolished it, it would be a rounding error on the amount of health and age pension spending we've got in this country. I mean, people really have this warped view of where the money's going. People think, if we cut all the things I don't like, trim back on welfare and cut the money to the ABC and get rid of the Aboriginal industry, it doesn't save you enough money. It doesn't get you within cooee of solving the budget deficit. We're eventually going to have people have the hard discussions about addressing the things that are popular. And I don't know how to do that. I suspect we just can't. We'll run deficits forever until Western civilization implodes. But that's a bit of a black pill. Hopefully we do better than that. But it's going to be a tricky one. But in the meantime, the Liberal Party needs to cut tax, because no matter what is true about the budget balance, Labor has cut tax first. Going back, I'm bringing this back on track here. Labor has cut tax first, and they don't have a choice now. So now they have to come up with something smarter and bigger and better. So if you're watching
it doesn't even have to be smarter. It just has to be bigger and better. They just cut tax harder up.
Well, I mean, they did that with Medicare. Oh, Labor said $8.5 billion. I say, $9 billion for Medicare. I will beat you.
Yeah, it just can't be incremental. It just needs to be whatever Labor's saying they're going to do. We're going to do it triple. Because otherwise, anything.
I think they have to do something different. I think it'll look tacky and pathetic if they just do the similar thing but bigger. I think they have to do something that looks different, which is why that family tax idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, is there any legs in their old stage 3 stuff and bring in some of the bracket creep prevention stuff back in? Can they do some of that stuff which is hurting people? Like fix
it. Good. I'd suggest
you blow your budget out by $17 billion.
Notice they should actually, I mean, this would be something that really changes the discussion. They should index tax brackets. I mean, that one, it decreases the amount of money that they get long-term significantly, but they only lose a little bit per year. It's like 3 or 4 billion per year. That's actually quite achievable inside the what's currently being spent and taxed by the Labor Party. So I think that policy is unambiguously good, because firstly, it's just good economics. We currently have bracket creep, which for the people watching along, if you've been watching us before, you probably know what it is. But inflation pushes more of your income into a higher tax bracket, meaning you're paying a higher average tax, a higher average income tax on your income, even if your real income, i.e. your income adjusted for inflation, has stayed the same. So if you're getting no richer, you could end up paying more and more tax as a percentage of your income because of bracket creep pushing you into higher brackets. There's an easy solution. You index the tax brackets. Now, I think it's just ridiculously unfair that we're just driving people into higher tax brackets without them getting richer. It's also, productivity destroying, that we just constantly have this built-in mechanism to only ever increase the size of government. But here's the kicker from the Liberal Party. It's good politics, because it hamstrings future Labor governments. I mean, the Liberal Party is always going to pretend or try or say that they're going to try and keep these taxes on track and not blow out spending and balance the budget. Then Labor gets in, they take advantage of the bracket creep, they spend the money like crazy, the Liberals feel like backed into a corner, they have to agree with it, and it's hard for them to be able to build a narrative. index tax brackets now when you get in. And then when Labor gets in next, they either have to go to the public and say, oh, we want to increase your tax. Good. Let them run on that, right? Or they just have to say, oh, screw it. We're having massive deficits. Or they have to show some spending restraint. And then that takes away one of the things that Labor always does to the Liberals. As Labor's going out, they just blow a shit ton of money and they leave the Liberals to have to try and make the difficult decisions, the politically unpopular decisions to fix it up, like NDIS at the last minute, just throw this grenade inside the Liberal Party room. And the Liberal Party, dumb enough to say, oh, yes, we'll keep doing it. And then it just blows up on the Liberal Party watch. That was like a last minute idea from Labor as the Gillard government was on the way out. If you guys remember back to 2013, it takes away Labor's easy ability just to ramp up this spending and get away with it. So I think it's just good politics to index tax brackets. It doesn't cost that much in the first year. It does by the 10th year, but the 10th year is off budget, so no one can see it. So you don't lose anything politically at the moment. It constrains the size of government. Win-win-win.
I mean,
Hey, Brian, you want to go back and sell that to you?
Just have a flat tax rate, but as you mentioned, the Overton window, that's probably a bit much for people to get their head around. That I've spoken about, and I've done the numbers. You guys actually run numbers, but the idea of what if we had 50K tax-free threshold, flat rate of 10% beyond that, and then we increase GST as a consumption tax. That way, your super rich people, they pay when they consume versus rorting and getting away with not paying taxes, because like you said, the top tax bracket over $500,000 or whatever, they're not paying that much tax anyway because they've got offsets and they're all minimizing it. And what was the old line from Kerry Packer? Like, no, if you're paying more tax than you have to, you're an idiot.
They're already income splitting.
Dean Reinhardt is not getting screwed by the top tax bracket.
Yeah, they're also income splitting, which is the other dirty little secret. So allowing income splitting just allows the rest of us to catch up to what rich people are doing anyway, because they've got company income and trust income. Here's a similar idea: 50K tax-free threshold, 20% above. I mean, one of the ideas I suggested was abolishing the bottom tax bracket, the 16% bracket, slowly over time to put it inside the Overton window, which would get you up to 45, and then you bump it from 45 to 50. So I'm also pitching for a $50,000 tax-free threshold. Rick Matt's policy here, I think, is the exact same one as the Libertarians. I got to say, I don't like the idea of bumping up the GST. I think it's dangerous.
We can't increase any taxes, but I mean, someone's going to pay for roads somewhere.
GST is a federal tax. I know they pass it on to the states, but they do it in a bastardized way so as to ruin our federation. But the Constitution doesn't allow the states to do it themselves. But also they've done this trade-off before, right? So they cut your income tax, they put up GST, but then bracket creep takes your income tax back up.
That's why we don't have bracket creep. We just have a flat rate.
You'd still have bracket creep if you have a tax-free threshold, unless you index that tax-free threshold. So you could index the tax-free threshold, I guess, and then you'd be able to solve it. But you still have bracket creep because some people earning 45, bit of inflation, now they're earning 55, now they're in your tax system. Also, the only real benefit of GST...
Just everyone commit tax evasion. Just screw it. Just starve the government. Stop paying the ATO. Buy bullion, bury it in your backyard, tell them you lost it in a fishing trip. Just, seriously. It's the only way we're going to starve this beast.
Well, which is also why I think that Liberals should just cut tax far more than they can afford inside the budget. Just, even if you can't balance the budget, cut tax anyway, because that is starving the beast is the only thing that might force them to be vaguely responsible in the out years. And I know that theory's been around for a while. It hasn't always worked perfectly, but I don't see anything working perfectly. So, there doesn't seem to be anything else that
like sticking to the establishment norms is clearly not working perfectly, where we now pretend a $42 billion deficit is like, oh, yeah, man. Yeah,
just print it.
Actually, I didn't see any commentary on that
number. I was like, "Hang on, am I reading that right?" And I sent it around to people, and the response I got was like the tone of the response I got was like, "Yeah, 42 bill, is what it is."
Yeah. I didn't see much commentary on it when I was following along with ABC commentary, and they were asking questions. They really didn't ask about that. It didn't seem to be the main thing they wanted to do is criticize Labor for having tax cuts, because of course our ABC is unbiased. They criticize Liberal and Labor. They just criticize Liberal and Labor from the left perspective from both of them. Like they think Liberal and Labor are both too right wing, and that's why ABC is equal opportunity socialist, anti-capitalist muckraking. But yeah, their main line of attack on Labor was that how dare you cut taxes? Won't they cause inflation? Which also isn't true. But in that conversation and the next one and Jackie Lambie getting very weird, watched all of those. No one brought up the size of the budget deficit. I know it's her MO. We need a word for it. She cries and yells at the same time.
Yeah,
she gets very emotional. It's like angry tears to try and imply that she's the only moral person left on earth.
It's like scream crying.
Scream crying. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, don't reverse that. Don't do the spinnerism the other way. It's going to.
Yeah, I thought about that.
I fed all the budget papers into Notebook LM, Google's thing, and I just asked it what the forecast deficits are. It says 24-25 deficit of 50.6 billion, 25-26 of forecast deficit of 44.2 billion. Then it goes to 35, 37, 36. So they are showing it on a downward trajectory of the deficit.
Well, that doesn't sound right. So where are you getting this? Because you can just read the budget papers.
Yeah, I was just trying to get AI to summarize it for me. So,
well, this is just the this is the underlying cash balance. I was about to bring up the fiscal balance as well. Maybe they're doing fiscal balance, but most people do underlying cash.
This is 1.8% of GDP. Yeah, that's the fiscal balance. Sorry, that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
All right, I was just about to check the fiscal balance, but this is the underlying cash balance here, 42. I don't know if you can see that. The highlighted one at the top, 42 billion.
Oh, yeah.
Which, by the way, we also need to celebrate. We need a little sort of champagne poppers or whatever. You know, cheers. Cheers, Dave. Celebrate. We've just made $1 trillion gross debt for the country.
Yay.
1 trillion. We've never done that before.
Celebrate good times. Come on.
It's a moment our country can be proud.
I like the term that Matt Barry uses, which is Project Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
What we're doing here. We're Australia's just trying their own version of Project Zimbabwe, and the average house will cost $11 bazillion dollars in the next 5 years.
So this is the number I think your AI had found. The fiscal balance.
Yeah, that sounds right.
50 in the year one, 44.32. Now, these numbers from here on out, I think aren't too dissimilar. The big difference here in the year just finishing is, you guys may remember the government has cut HEX by 20%.
Yes.
So HEX is a financial asset for the government. The government owns an asset called people are going to give me money. They're going to repay the HEX debt. And so they've just laughed off 20% of that. Now, do you know how much that impacts the cash balance, which is the budget balance that everyone in the media reports? It's what they announce in the budget. It's what everyone talks about. The government does this big policy of laughing off 20% of HEX. The impact on the underlying cash balance, on the budget balance?
Zero. Because it
doesn't show up.
It's future revenue. It's not cash, right?
No cash has left the door. It's an accrual change.
Yeah.
So it shows up in the fiscal balance. So here's the fiscal balance. This is why this 50 billion is so much higher than the underlying cash deficit, which is something like 23 or something. So this is where it showed up. No one really noticed, right? Everyone just waves it through. The media just keep reporting the underlying cash balance, and the government gets to announce these policies. Like the other couple of ones that they announced. I should take away that comment here. The other one they announced is more money towards the NBN. Doesn't show up on the budget. The other one they announced is more money to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation so they can fund more of their net zero renewable crap.
Green steel. He talked about green hydrogen and green steel in the budget speech. I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, if Twiggy Forrest can't make it work, how is Jim Chalmers going to make it work?
But here's the kicker. It's not in the budget, right? I mean, they get to talk about it in the budget. He can say the words. It's not in the budget papers because they do as an equity investment into this sort of fake government bank, and that government bank invests in these projects. That's why the idea you were saying before. I mean, I like the theory, Brian, of saying take all of the money the government's wasting on net zero and redirect it towards tax cuts. The problem is the general government sector isn't spending a lot of that money. They have already transferred that money into government businesses, and those government businesses are then lending money onto people, and then the government shuts down their competition to make sure they make money. It is
the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is lending the money. Right.
It's a diabolical scheme, but it makes it really hard to actually come and take that money out and put it back into proper places. I mean, my best suggestion, and I doubt they'll have the guts to do it because they never do, but when the Liberals get in, they just need to tweak the parameters of that government bank and use that government bank to invest in coal mines and sort of coal-fired power. But at the moment, the government has done a pretty good job of hiding where they put a lot of this money.
That's the thing that gets me with stuff like the HEX stuff is they build a HEX as cost of living relief. And I'm like, anyone who's paying a HEX debt knows or should know that just means you might pay it off a little bit sooner, but that's not going to affect you week to week, month to month out of your paycheck. Your PAYG is still going to get deducted the same amount, whether you've got a 40k hex debt or a 35k hex debt until it's gone. And so for
Well, the
them to
other
say
thing is
we are helping with cost of living relief is just it's a lie.
The other thing is, if you have a HEX debt, you went to uni. And so you either went to uni because you were studying something that made you more productive, and therefore you get more income. You get the benefit of going to uni. You bloody pay for it.
You agreed to the bill.
Or you went to uni to do something that doesn't make you more productive. Therefore, it's of no use to the country, and it's just a hobby. And the government shouldn't be massively cross-subsidizing your hobbies. Either way, there shouldn't be this big cross. This is why this Clive Palmer policy of free education is such a daft piece of socialism. It's so cringeworthy. Oh no, he's come out with it again. Same thing he did with UAP. I'm pretty sure most of the little trumpet peons hate the policy, but they have to pretend to like it because Clive has money. And yeah, he wants to make education free. He wants to massively cross-subsidize the academic bureaucratic elite that hates Western civilization and wants to destroy everything that we believe in. And he thinks that if you massively subsidize those Marxists, somehow,
they'll just become.
That's the first step. Second step, ... Third step, world domination. We haven't worked out that.
Step one, give money to Marxists. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, right-wing Australia.
Yes, something like that.
The depth of their policy. I saw their Sue Ellen Wrights and their the next Prime Minister of Australia apparently on with Chris Kenny. And he was asking her some pretty basic things around, you've said X, Y, Z. How are you going to do that? And she's like, she's like, we'll work that out when we get closer to it. It's like, what do you mean? You're saying you got this policy and you haven't actually got any detail? You're going to work it out? And Chris Kenny just eviscerated her. And I was like, oh, it's not a good start to your campaign. On the clean energy thing, I got my Google tool to search through. I looked up for green hydrogen, and you're right, it's all like Clean Energy Foundation, whatever it is. But then this little cracker, it's not a big amount, but I think it's worth talking about. The First Nations Clean Energy Futures Grant Program with 70 million over 3 years, which is in the women's budget papers. So in the women's budget papers, it talks about First Nations Clean Energy Futures Grants Program.
Oh, that has all of your favorite things, Dave. It's got clean energy.
The program aims to reduce barriers for First Nations communities to access clean energy and support new First Nations-led clean energy projects, potentially including green hydrogen initiatives. It also specifically aims to support First Nations women to participate in the clean energy transition. It's like, let's put all of the jingo buzzwords we can into one
So just a second,
policy.
Dave. Speaking of transitioning transgender limp-wristed women, I think Brian has to leave us.
I do.
Is that?
I do. It's very limp-wristed of me. But thank you guys. For viewers at home, I think if you are vaguely coalition aligned, or even if you're minor party right, but you at least want a coalition government and then a hardcore minor party Senate, you should call your local coalition MP and tell them that off the back of this, you expect some fucking massive tax cuts.
And as Brian said before, making those phone calls actually makes a difference because they think if you're daft enough to make a phone call, you must really care. So, but if nothing else, just get in touch with them any which way you can. This is the time to ramp up the pressure. Brian, I will see you next time. We'll work out when that is. Maybe Thursday.
Yep.
But Godspeed. Thanks for coming. No, I'm not going to last too much longer here, Dave, because it's getting hot in here.
I'm here at your leisure, my friend. So,
but I did want to note one other thing. Now, you're going to have to put Brian sort of does well at knocking the boffiny edges off me sometimes when they do this. I speak economics, he speaks to humans. But sometimes I see things and I feel the need to say them aloud, just to whichever daft bastard is sticking around to hear me. And I was just... now, I mentioned before the gross debt is over $1 trillion. Alhamdulillah, we've made it. Now, the gross debt's the wrong number, right? Because you have gross debt, but if you have other financial assets...
It's pretty gross
that
as far as debts go.
Yes. That doesn't show the real position. So a lot of people then use the net debt, which they think that's the more accurate number. So instead of this, here's it, the 1.02 trillion, they'll say, oh no, the correct number is this net debt. You see, next debt's only 620 billion. They're rising up to 780. Now, the trick to that is net debt doesn't include the fact that the government has to pay superannuation to their workers. Once you factor that in, you actually get this far more accurate number here. And the interesting thing is you only have to roll this 2 years forward. And even with the accurate number, so the gross debt is the wrong number, right? It's just it's for show. It gives you a big number, but it's not the accurate position of the government's finances. This net financial liabilities is the accurate reflection of the government's finances. And maybe we'll have to delay 2 years before we have the real
$1 trillion party.
The real cheers. But yes, the $1 trillion party is just around the corner. We're still going to make it. What is that? In year 27, 28. Are you guys seeing the same thing I'm seeing? I think you are.
Yeah, which is just in time for the next election.
Yeah, we get to celebrate. And here's the underlying cash balance. Here's the underlying cash balance. These are the numbers they're officially announcing. And then if we factor in this cheeky investment in financial assets for policy purposes, so this number actually captures the amount of money they funnel into NBN, the amount of money they funnel into the CEFC, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So that's a bad acronym. KEFC. Very Kafka. It's very Kafka-esque. So maybe that's
yes. Nice.
But those numbers show up here. So then if you wanted to include those, you shouldn't always include them, but you sometimes should, then you get these much bigger deficits. So wow. Not that anyone even cared about the 42 billion. So I doubt we'll be able to convince many journalists to care about those numbers, but they are not small numbers. By the way, the other number, let me see if I can bring this one up here.
Building Australia's future.
Yeah. Let's get down the bottom. Nah, it's not the one.
Why you look that up? I remember I went to ARC last year and who was the Ultra Costello got up, and it was showing how the average tax per person, man, woman, child, versus spending per man, woman, and child, and how it compares from when he was in government to now. And it's just shocking the increase in tax, but even the increase in spending, which is way beyond the amount of tax they're taxing us. Like just this living off the credit card and what it's doing to the interest bill.
Yeah, and Australia's actually doing better than most countries, but we're still trending the wrong way. It's this kind of has it here. This shows you the history. So it gives you takes you all the way back to that year, but screw that. I don't want to go on 2 pages. So back to 2016. That's the dollars. The dollars aren't the right number. Percentage of GDP also isn't quite the right number, but it gives you an idea. If this is going up, that's trending the wrong way. It used to be this number was hovered around 22, 23, maybe 24%. 26% for revenue, over 27%. So that's eye-watering. That number there. This I saw that I think just before you came on, and I pointed out that that's going to be one of my headlines here when I do the write-up tomorrow. That is a massive increase in just the size of the federal government. The correct way to look at the numbers, by the way, is this last chart, which shows you adjust the numbers. Real per capita is what they call it here. So you adjust the numbers for the amount of people. So you don't want to be getting tricked by if there's more people in the country, you get more revenue, but I didn't have to pay more tax.
This was the sort of numbers Costello was pulling out. Yeah, these ones, the 14, 15,000, yeah.
And these numbers only exist in the budget because of the Libertarian Party, or formerly Liberal Democrats. This is one of the few ongoing changes that David Lionel made when he was in the Senate. He convinced the Liberal Party to report on these numbers so that we'd be able to accurately point at the unstoppable growth in government. And kudos to him. Well done to him for this. And yeah, is it total receipts? Just going back to 2010. That's not that long ago. It's not like the world was falling apart. Now this is adjusted for population, adjusted for inflation. So there's no excuse. There's no reason for this to be going up, right? So this is per person. So the population doesn't matter, and adjusted for inflation from 13,800 to 18. What is that? That's a nearly 50% increase. Like a 40% increase, something in the order of. I asked everyone at home, do you feel like you're getting 40% more from your government? Do you think they're doing a 40% better job? Is that the quality of health and education and roads and the quality of immigration policy, are they all 40% better than what they were in 2010? I mean,
and for your approximately 30% extra taxes that you're giving them on the receipts column.
Oh, and where is this? On this side?
Yeah, the receipts have gone from 12.9 to 16.6 on the left one. The far.
That's the one I was already looking at.
I thought you were looking at receipts in the middle.
Taxed.
Oh, that's receipts. Oh yeah, sorry, that's receipts.
This is tax and non-tax. So don't worry about these two. Just add those up.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
This is the spending over here. Spending's gone from 15 up to 19. So that one's gone up by what? 40%, 30%.
Yeah.
Sweet mercies. But I mean, do we really feel in any scenario that the quality of government services or the quality we're getting given by our politicians and bureaucrats, is it 30 to 40% better for us? Or is it maybe 30 to 40% better for the bureaucrats that are now getting paid? I mean, this really throws it in your face. This is the stark graph. I always put this redo this graph every time a budget comes out. I haven't yet because I've been live on air since the budget came out, but I'll be doing this tomorrow. And this is the one that really just smacks you in the face. And there's always some excuse for why the government should grow, or sometimes they look at percentage of GDP, which can be manipulated and give you the wrong impression. But I don't know what the response is here. I mean, I know partly what the response is. Governments just feel the need to buy votes every election, and also part of this is the aging population. So we've got the aging population. As you know, fertility rates are collapsing, aging population. And that means with the current system we have for aged care and for healthcare just is unsustainable. The welfare state we have set up is unsustainable. It will break. We either reform it carefully and responsibly now, or we just wait for it to collapse, and there will be crying and gnashing of teeth and cats living with dogs, and the whole world will be mad.
I love a good Ghostbusters reference. Well done.
Just checking the comments coming in. Fiat incentives stay broken.
The thing that gets me is also when you look at those two columns, the payments is in almost every single year bigger than the receipts. Like they're just spending more than they earn year after year after year after year after year. Like where is the surplus budgets being delivered anywhere in there almost?
Well, Howard, I'll take you back to the Howard years.
Yeah, right. That's Costello. They did that. Then that's what he was saying.
There
He
you
was
go.
saying back in our days.
Revenue bigger than spending. Revenue about the same as
06,
spending.
07, 15,
Revenue bigger than
13.
spending.
Yep.
Revenue bigger than spending.
So they,
there you
as
go.
much as and you said Howard's not a political hero, and I've been, as I've gotten older and a bit more involved and look back at history, I go, was offshoring all our industry really the greatest move they could have done? A few things I question about that era of politics. But ultimately, when it comes to some of this fiscal management, where you go, well, at least they lived within their means. Good on them.
Well, wait a second. We've got to put this in context. So where did he started? He started here. Living within his means, partly because revenue went from $10,000 per person up to $15,000. So he just allowed taxes to go up, real, adjusted for inflation per capita. He allowed taxes to go up by 50%, while spending just went up from 11 to 14. So spending went up by 30%. So he massively increased spending, but he massively increased tax by even more. And because of that, he was able to balance the budget. Now, sure, you should balance a budget when you can, but God, that's like, again, 1 star at best here. Like massively increasing the government, but massively increasing tax further. And a lot of that's because he just allowed bracket creep to run rampant. In the early years, he gave back a bit of bracket creep. And then in the latter years, he just let it rip.
In the latter years,
so
you just open the borders.
Yeah. Well, look, also, I think the outsourcing industry, that was going to happen anyway. That's, I think, a function of things outside of his control. But I mean, he also took our guns. And I don't think GST was a good idea in hindsight. It's centralized power in Canberra, because I think decentralization is the only way to actually fight against the power of bureaucracy. But
yep. I mean, why are we running parallel education departments federally and at the state? That's.
Oh, just remind me how many schools the Federal Department of Education runs.
Right. And all this like, oh, we're going to fully fund all the schools. How about like go the school vouchers thing? Make schools earn the freaking revenue.
Well, yes, I agree with vouchers. The tricky part with vouchers, of course, is the current spending on schools is split between the federal and the state government, which again is just a problem with the fact the federal government raises too much money. So again, I go back to my preference is you abolish the federal income tax, allow states to have state income taxes if they want, and all of health and all of education and all of welfare is put down to state government level. Allow competition. Victoria will be Victoria. Smart people can leave. We can set up better states. Hopefully one of the states takes a risk on trying to be economically responsible.
I think we should have more states. I think all our states are way too big. You talk about pushing the Overton window out. I think we should chop our states up. We should be New South Wales should be at least 3 states.
Yeah, absolutely. I've long been. I have to update these numbers because I don't think they're true anymore. But if we had the same population to state ratio that we had when Australia became a federation, we should have over 30 states, and that sounds like a good starting point to me. I mean, we can go from there. But yeah, absolutely, we should have more states, and the states should be the nexus of power. They trickle some money up to the federal government when we need to go and invade New Zealand or whatever we need to do at the federal level. But the power should be at the state level, and the states should be smaller and a lot more of them.
Because our founders looked at the US and they read Hamilton's papers and went, oh, federalism, that sounds like a good idea. And so they kind of implemented it, but then it became less federalism and more, like a new monarchy over the
Well, our High Court's always been kind of retarded in the way they interpret it. And also they had this one get out of jail free clause with any time the federal government signs up to an international treaty, they can use that international treaty as justification for, look, I signed a treaty saying that we would keep Australia's health gooder. So now I can just take over the health department. It's like, that's not what the framers of the Constitution meant, but that they've got away with it. So I think it's the federal income tax is the, to my mind, the thing that is preventing proper federation in the country. So that doesn't even have to be that radical a move. I mean, you could just get rid of the federal income tax, introduce the state income taxes at the same level, still being coordinated by the ATO, and just decentralize health and education while keeping all of the same schools and hospitals exactly the same as they are today. But now it's at a state level. And then over time, you could allow competition to allow the Victorians to become socialist twats and the rest of us to be able to improve our states, and people can move to whichever state is doing the better job. Although I don't think we should let the Victorians
can comparatively Australia to America, just looking at continent mass, and I get we've got more desert and stuff, but we are so much less mobile. People just, they live, they learn, they work, they die, normally within sort of a 15K radius. Like that's how Australians generally seem to be. There's not this, there's a motivation. I can get a better job there and pay less taxes or get cheaper homes. Everything's rooted everywhere, so I might as well stay where I am and die here.
Well, there's also nearly everyone in Australia seems to have this genetic need to live within 50 kilometers of the same 5 CBDs, which I think is bad for everyone, right? I mean, it makes it unavoidable that those prices are going up. I mean, you can build as much as you like in the world. It just gets harder and harder to get to the places where people want to live, closer and closer to the center. Those prices are inevitably going to go up. If that's where everyone wants to live, you can't solve that price problem.
And people are pushing north and south on the East Coast, and it's making them crap as well. No one's going inland. We need a development in your Dubbos and your Woggers and your Alburys and your...
I don't mind the north and south. I mean, Gympie and Harvey Bay and Coffs Harbour and Port Macquarie, those are great places to live. But I mean,
the property prices in Port Mac are insane. You go up to Port Macquarie and the property, it's mental.
Well, they just need to allow the development there, or allow there's a lot of lovely land all the way between the Illawarra and Mackay. I'll stop it there because it's too hot above Mackay, but there's still nice land above there, I'm sure. There's lots of places where some of these villages can become towns and towns can become cities, and you go inland. But everyone's stuck with these big cities, and just to go on a hobby horse that has nothing to do with the budget, cities are fertility killers. I mean, we look at you probably know these stats about fertility just plummeting worldwide. Humans becoming an endangered species in slow motion. I grant it, so people can't see it, so I don't care. But we're well below. We've just gone below replacement, I think, worldwide. Everyone's below replacement, pretty much, except sub-Saharan Africa. And I think when historians look back at the 21st century, they're not going to remember any of this other bullshit, the war on terror, climate change, all of this other bullshit that will be forgotten. They'll just go, oh, yeah, that was the century where the human population imploded. Wow, that was amazing. I wonder what they were doing to prepare for it. Nothing. And if you look at the data, big cities, absolute fertility killers. People living with a backyard, with a community they know, with white picket fence, 2.4 kids and a Volvo station wagon. I mean, that's the cliche, but it's still...
In 200 years' time, they'll be, wow, why were people so pale back then?
All right. Question from Rob here. I don't know what this question is, so I hope it's not stupid. But I've said recently per capita DP. Do you mean GDP? I assume seems like a better measurement to me than GDP. Is this somehow non-libertarian? No, that's fine. He's just talking about data. If not, does things like big reduce immigration and tariffs make some sense? These are two different questions, I think. So firstly, if you're talking about data, you use different data for different reasons. So total GDP is relevant if you're thinking, oh, I'm thinking of invading that country. I wonder how many resources I could bring to bear, how many tanks and planes I can buy. For that, you don't use per capita GDP. You need total GDP, like just how much shit can you buy. So total GDP is useful if you're just looking at sort of global geopolitics. But if you're looking at the prosperity of the people in the country, and most of the time that's what we care about, then GDP per capita is a much bigger metric. GDP per person, right? Per capita is just, wanker technical term for saying per person. But even then, I'd go one step further, and we've done this chat on a previous live stream. GDP per person is an improvement, but what you really want is GDP per hour worked, because you could improve GDP per person by requiring everyone to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, and requiring sending kids back to work and making grandmas work and everything else. That would increase GDP per person. I don't think it would increase the quality of our lives. So what you really want is to increase GDP per hour worked. And then everyone can decide how many hours they want to work. I mean, you've got a choice now. Should I earn another $50 or should I take an hour off to go and play, Monopoly with my kids or whatever it's going to be, right? So that is what you really want to maximize. By the way, that term, GDP per hour worked, it has another name. It's literally productivity. That's the same thing that people like me harp on about all the time. And it's really the only way to ensure your country actually gets more prosperous and richer long term. If you're not improving productivity, you're playing the wrong game. And so, yeah, GDP per capita, good. GDP per hour, even better. GDP, meh, it's not really what you need. As for immigration and tariffs, they're kind of they're bundled together. They're often bundled together because people who support one approach often support the other. They don't need to be bundled together. There's a couple of different issues, and there'll be libertarians with different answers on this. So I'm not giving the libertarian answer, but I'm somewhat convinced by Hopper's argument on immigration, which is to say, if you didn't have a government, people would be creating their own restrictions on who gets to live near them. So if you're going to take away people's ability to control their own neighborhoods, if the government's going to step in and take away your ability to control the fences around your neighborhood, then the government has an obligation to sort of step in and also establish some fences around the national neighborhood. And the idea of trade is supposed to be that it's voluntary consent between both sides. The seller and the buyer are both happy with the trade. That's why they both benefit, because if they weren't benefiting, they wouldn't have done it. When someone immigrates to Australia, they clearly agree, but we haven't got dual consent, right? We haven't yet got consent of the people who are accepting them into that community. And if we got rid of the Civil Rights Act and allowed sort of much stricter discrimination and cruelty, which I think we should, but if we do that, then people would be able to just set up their boundaries and say, no immigrants in my town, or whatever they want to say. And then perhaps there'd be less rationale for the government to do it. But clearly at the moment, people aren't allowed to do that. And that then opens up a libertarian argument for the government restricting the number of people coming in. So I think there's a pretty good libertarian case for being skeptical of immigration. With trade, it's much harder to make the libertarian case for tariffs, except for moderate tariffs for revenue raising reasons. So if you had a moderate tariff, you raise a bit of money, use that to cut income tax. I mean, the trick with taxes is low levels of tax have fairly low efficiency cost. High levels of tax have really high. It's an exponential graph, right? The more you increase the tax, the more you totally fuck up your economy. So we've right now got ridiculously high income taxes that are really screwing up our economy, and we've got very low tariffs. So if you bumped up those tariffs a bit and you cut income taxes, that's not going to ruin your economy. I mean, you're probably adjusting your tax mix towards a more efficient tax mix. Now, that's not to say tariffs are good. It's just to say at this point, they're probably less bad than our high income taxes. So you could probably make a bit of a change there. My fear is that a lot of people running the tariff line at the moment, that's not what they mean. What I just said there isn't what they're pushing. They're pushing we need tariffs high enough to stop imports coming in, hoping that we'll produce stuff at home, which I think would be utterly disastrous. It's very unpopular these days, or unsexy these days, to point to the data on the benefits we've had in productivity, GDP per hour work, the ability for us to actually take time off and buy stuff we want, the impact between the sort of international interactions and that boom in GDP per hour worked. But it is significant, and I don't know this many people would be happy to going back to halving their real wages these days. So we probably want to hold on to some of that. Now, the trick is the advocates for a sort of globalized world, they point out correctly that you can get those benefits from international trade, you can get those benefits from international people movement, and you can get those benefits from international capital movement. And so they argue for all three of those. Here's the sting, right? Here's the kicker. You only need to do one of them. Right? If you do one of those three, you get 90% of the economic benefits of globalization. You don't need to do all three. Right? We seem to be stuck in this mentality of either you do none of them and we just all agree to become dirt poor, or we do all of them and you have to do all of them. And I find it a strange mentality. I think we should be quite open to trade, and that allows us to actually be much stricter on immigration and stricter on capital flows if you want to be. I've got less of a strong opinion about that. But you actually, sorry?
Yeah, no, so I know talking to the other libertarians around tariffs and anti-protectionism sort of policies and stuff. But where does that fit from the point of view of sovereign security and sovereign capability to manufacture certain things, given there might be blockades or wartime footing and so on? Because at the moment, I feel like we've completely gutted our manufacturing to the point in the name of free trade where we can't produce anything given a wartime footing because we were an isolated nation, and if shipping lanes and so on, we saw even with COVID, with shipping lanes and issues from getting stuff from China. Heaven forbid we are at some sort of aggressive tension with China where they completely cut us off.
War. It's called a war. Can't say it.
What is it good for?
No, I take your point. Look, I think there's probably space for that on national defense ground on a couple of specific industries. But here's the things to keep in mind. If we went autarky, which is, if we just produced everything, which realistically, to be able to run a full war without any imports, you have to go pretty bloody autarky. I mean, you have to be making the buttons on the uniforms. You have to be making the casings for the rounds. You have to go pretty bloody North Korean style autarky, which makes you pretty bloody North Korean style prosperity, which means we're going to lose the war anyway. Like if we fight against New Zealand when we're that poor, we're already lost. So like that's not really a solution. Realistically, we're going to be trading with someone if we're going to have a chance of winning. If China successfully blockades us, we've already lost. The only chance we've got is that we've got allies who can get around the Chinese blockade, which of course is our strategy there because we've got some friends who are pretty good at sailing boats around Chinese blockades at the moment.
And because our own navy is gutted and weak.
But do we really think that a Chinese military couldn't beat an Australia with a significantly reduced GDP if our GDP halved, do you really think people are going to passively accept the cuts in welfare and healthcare? I mean, it will be social collapse. So we're not going to defend ourselves successfully with under a pure autarky. And so if you go back to only partial autarky, fine. If it's partial autarky, well, still either we run the blockade or we eventually lose because we still can't, get the shell casings for the rounds or whatever it is that we aren't able to do. So either way, we're going to have to be able to run the blockade. We're going to have have I think the real question on this is not should we be trading for some things that we really need in a time of war? The question is, who are we trading with? Like, are we become reliant on the exact people that we expect to be in a conflict with? What are our backup plans? Like, these are the three countries we're most likely to be at war with. These are the things that we currently buy from them. Who else can we buy from and how good is our trading relationship with them? Or, maybe, the tariff should be a little bit higher on them to incentivize us to buy from this other country, which we are, much more confident is going to be supplying us those buttons on our uniforms and casings on our rounds or whatever it is we need. So look, there are real security issues to be factored in with trade. But I think the idea, the logical implication of that can be going full autarky, which is a pretty incoherent position. I mean, you're not going to survive as full autarky. Autarky means not trading, by the way, just to unwrap the wanker word.
Thank you for that. That's a good discussion to have, and something I'm curious around, just trying to vet out, because there are certain sovereign things we should have the ability to make, like steel. Because if we do ever need to build tanks or ships or anything, and we can't even manufacture our own steel because we've a lot of our steel mills collapsed because they couldn't afford to it, and we said we're going to put green hydrogen in place to do it, which was never going to happen.
Okay, there may be a case for that, but I counter thought experiment. If New Zealand had a good steel industry, there's no scenario where we're not going to war and still being able to access New Zealand. I mean, that's not too much different to us putting the steel industry in Tasmania, and people wouldn't go,
I think we
no,
buy
the
our
steel
cans
industry's in
from New
Tasmania.
Zealand, right? We can't can our own food anymore. We actually have to send it over there to be canned because all our canneries shut down over here. I mean,
Some of that stuff
seems
sounds very embarrassing, but you're also got to remember with trade that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. So, I mean, every time you decrease imports, you're going to decrease an offsetting export, and that's fine. Maybe we want to do that. Maybe we think too many people are working in the export industries. Kind of by definition, our export industries are going to pay higher wages than the businesses that replace those export industries, because those businesses that replace it could currently exist, and they don't because these other ones are more efficient.
My favorite export is the rental that our foreign students pay.
Well, that comes down to an immigration issue, so we can fix that one with immigration.
Don't they book that as an export? Huh.
Yes. Money being spent by foreigners as they visit Australia is counted as an export. Yeah. So I'm not sure if it is if they're residents. It might not be while they're residents. So I'm not sure about students.
I don't know. Maybe Anyway.
But yes, tourists here.
Thank you. That's helpful just to think out and talk through sovereign security, trading, fair trade, protectionism, tariffs, etc.
Yeah, and I think that that last point, it sounds boffiny and kind of daft, but it's worthwhile people remembering in the back of their mind. A tax on imports is a tax on exports. You will decrease imports if you do that. If you put tariffs high enough, you will
people see
successfully decrease imports.
what Trump's doing. People forget that Trump has massive economic leverage. The US economy is so huge, he really can use that as a negotiating wedge against other countries to get what he wants and use it for
if it's a
diplomatic
negotiating
purposes.
tactic, if it's a negotiating tactic,
Right.
then great, and it fits Trump because the personality type you want to do that negotiating tactic is like as a crazy person, right? You want people to actually think that you believe it, and you think you don't give a shit if you're going to burn your country down, and that's what gives you a good bargaining position. Trump has a good bargaining position in a strong country, so if it's all negotiating tactics, then great. I mean,
But we don't have
Machiavellian,
that
it's
economic
fun.
leverage, and our exports are so disparity with China. We're so reliant on them buying stuff to prop up our GDP with exports that we can't play hardball politics with them over it because we're too scared of rooting our GDP. Because all of a sudden, like, oh no, they'll stop buying stuff off us, and oh, we're screwed now.
Well, but you can start taking soft core steps towards that. I mean, if you did shut up all that sales to China tomorrow, it would screw us. But I mean, if you know that could screw us, then what we could do is start taking slow steps towards diversifying trade partners. So, maybe we accidentally forget that free trade agreement we had with China, and maybe we discover that it was a good idea to have a free trade agreement with, what's the country that always hates China? Vietnam. Great. So good. So let's diversify a little bit. We're going to need to have some good trade relationship with some low income countries, some low wage countries, because that's just the convenient way to get some shit much cheaper than what the other is good. But it doesn't always have to be China. Surely there's another country on earth we can find to diversify our trade with, so we're less at risk.
Well, there's definitely countries that we can give rugby teams to.
Yeah, I don't know if the productivity in PNG is high enough for us to be able to do that, but it's we could look into that. It's the oddity I find though is people that necessarily bundle those together. I actually think that by keeping fairly free trade, it actually allows you to keep nearly all of the benefits of globalization while massively scaling back immigration or massively scaling back capital flows if you wanted to do that, which there may be a case for that as well. But you look at those three, and the current pitch has been you've got to have people flows, you've got to have capital flows, you've got to have flows of goods and services. And taken on their own, if you just looked at each one of those issues, there's a pretty comprehensive and thorough and good argument that it creates a lot of benefits. But they're all creating the same benefit. You don't create them 3 times, right? You don't get 3 times the benefit by doing all 3 of them. They're all giving you the same benefit, right? They're overlapping. So as long as you do one of them, you don't really need to do the other 2. So that's another case why, because I do think we need to scale back on immigration. And I think it's easier to do that with less economic impact if we still have robust free trade most of the time. But anyway, I will be pissing off your audience at the moment by saying this. My audience should still be okay with it, but screw it. This has gone longer than I expected. We're up to 3 hours.
Oh, I didn't even see the button stream this to your audience. I haven't been co-streaming. I apologize.
Oh, no, I don't even know how to do that. But is there a way?
There's a button on mine that says stream this to your audience, but I use Restream, not StreamYard, so I'm not unfamiliar with this this layout. Anyway.
Yeah, I didn't know that
Inside
existed.
baseball.
No, I just figured that some people on X would see our ugly mugs and shoot in. But anyway, Dave, thank you for coming. Any final comments on the budget? We've segued into lots of topics here, but any final comments on the on this pre-election budget?
I think it's just a bunch of pork barreling, just trying to buy votes. I think they didn't want to necessarily deliver this budget, but they had to. They're trying to, wrap it in glitter and tell you it's pretty. The sooner we get rid of this Albanese government, the better. And hopefully Dutton and the Liberals actually can grow a pair and deliver something that's better.
Yeah, all right. My take is I had very low expectations for this budget, and it basically met my expectations, except tax cuts. Alhamdulillah. I think that is there's a massive budget deficit, and that's stupid. We should talk about that. They froze beer excise, so, that's kind of nice. But the main story here is the Liberals should have had tax cuts on the agenda long ago. Labor has now wrong-footed them. They've introduced a moderate, small, not enough, too late, but a step in the right direction, an actually good piece of economic reform, which people said before my expectations were low. Well, shouldn't they be? I mean, I think it's fair to have low expectations, but they have exceeded those expectations. So credit where it's due. I mean, if the baddies, if they get something right and you still condemn them, they have no incentive of ever getting anything right. Like if they do the right thing and we just go, well, you still suck, I still hate everything about you, there's no incentive for them to repeat getting something accidentally right. So I do want to give credit where it's due. It's good that those tax cuts are on the agenda. Now the Liberals need to do better. They need to come over the top of these tax cuts with even
Agreed.
better tax cuts. And that will be a fun part of this election budget season game for us to watch along with. And hopefully they take some of the advice that we've been giving here at the Taxpayers Alliance. That's taxpayers.org.au. Go to the website,
I hope
top right,
so.
membership.
I'd love to see real tax reform. So, and you've been pitching that. So I hope they pick that up and run with that, because that would benefit us all.
Inshallah, as your friends would say back home. Anyway, Dave, thanks a lot for joining. And hopefully we do this again sometime. And thank you, everyone. Listen along at home. I think we'll do something on Thursday. I don't know what yet, but you'll see me online. But normally Mondays, Thursdays, 8:30 p.m, the ATA live, talking about politics and policy. And then obviously sometimes just randomly, as in today. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And I'll see you next time.